Good morning. Would you like to have a look behind my curtains? 3 minutes after 10 is the time. I sometimes feel that we need more Toto the dog moments on the programme. You know, when Toto pulls back the curtain in The Wizard of Oz and reveals that the great and powerful Oz is actually a sort of dishevelled and confused old man desperately pushing buttons and pulling levers. I have some funny ideas before we come on air. Normally they're beaten out of me before the 10 o'clock news has come to an end. I was looking at Rishi Sunak's speech yesterday, and I was struggling to get a handle on it, struggling to get a sort of point of entry. So what am I supposed to be scared of? He's promising to protect me from the hooded claw, actually. I think he said at one point, I will keep the vampires from your door. When the chips are down, said the Prime Minister yesterday, I'll be around with my undying, death-defying love for you, which was an interesting departure for a political speech. But the stuff that I'm worried about, even perhaps frightened about, has largely already happened. And so coming on air and saying, what do you fear most, was a contender for our starter at 10 this morning. And yet, sometimes when I ask you questions that are too nebulous, if I set the goalposts so far apart that you actually can't see one goalpost from the other, then it doesn't always work very well. And also, it's a bit, I don't know, it didn't quite bite for me. And then that prison story that Nick was talking about, and revealing the state of our prisons, and that the quotes there from the prisons inspector, and that played almost directly into some ideas that were bubbling away in my brain as I walked down the stairs, because I want to talk about the harrowing tales that we all encountered yesterday about women having a child in England enduring a traumatic birth. I still do a double take, almost like a literal physical double take, like a cartoon character, when I read that 1 in 3 women who have a child in England now endure a traumatic birth. Some of the tales that you heard on LBC yesterday and elsewhere are, hair-raising and terrifying. But the prisons, of course, were being described in similarly chaotic terms in the news bulletin that you heard at 10 o'clock. And once you let that ball start rolling, it is it's deeply disturbing where it leads. Because the other thing that Sunak was talking about yesterday was not just the need to protect us, but also he was criticising Labour for what I believe he might have called doomsterism. Did you come across that word? But think about this for a minute, and I sometimes hesitate. This is what I mean about pulling back the curtains to see for certain what I thought I knew. You sort of worry about a domino effect, because I enjoy our time together every morning. I usually feel better at the end of it than I did at the beginning, and we have some fun together, and we make each other smile, hopefully, and we make each other laugh. So a sort of unleavened diet of doom is not something that I like to serve up every day, even when we're talking about the dark stuff or the serious stuff. We can usually, or you usually, manage to distract me with a silly text or bring in something a little bit more light-hearted. But if I start with maternity wards and move immediately to prisons, because that is the baton of bad news that has been passed from Monday to Tuesday this week, where does that baton go next? Maternity wards, prisons, schools, NHS hospitals, GP surgery, care homes, water, as in water companies, border checks, probation services. I mean, almost every area of our life that is publicly funded or the responsibility of government has been, well, what word would you use? Almost every area of life hasn't just been sort of diluted or damaged. It's been absolutely decimated. Don't send me pedantic messages about what decimated literally means. It is perfectly acceptable, perfectly permissible to use it, decimated, as a figure of speech, meaning greatly destroyed. Almost everything that they're in charge of has been decimated. Do you know what's in the news today? In the news today, they have abandoned the plans to make homelessness a crime or to criminalise homelessness. You remember that Suella Braverman wanted to criminalise tents if you're unfortunate enough to be living in a tent, the then Home Secretary's genius idea to cut down on people living in tents was to confiscate their tents. I remember sitting here and explaining that to you and wondering whether or not I'd sort of accidentally been microdosed with magic mushrooms. The Home Secretary suggesting that the best way to reduce the number of people sleeping in tents is to confiscate their tents. What do you confiscate next? Benches? Grass? Paving stones? And the other story in the news today, which my friend and colleague Henry Riley covered with extraordinary finesse yesterday. I don't know if you've seen or heard the clip of him with and again, here's a phrase that makes you think you've been microdosed with magic mushrooms. The Minister for Common Sense, Esther McVeigh, who is very cross about lanyards. Do you know what a lanyard is? I didn't know what a lanyard was until a couple of years ago. They've sprung up all over the place ever since you sort of need an electronic pass to get into your place of work. You know, you flash your sort of name card at the gate and the gate magically opens. She's very cross about lanyards for reasons that I couldn't really understand, but it had something to do with minorities getting too much support. Rainbow lanyards. So, I mean, that list, you can add to that list if you want. I've almost certainly missed stuff off it. But just in terms of this week, you start with the maternity wards and you hop to the prisons. Then you think about, what about shoplifting, actually? That's in the news as well. And you know about the state of the NHS, the waiting lists and the GP surgeries and the schools. The difficulties, of course, that teachers are having, just keeping afloat. And then you look at the cost of living crisis, you look at the energy bills, you look at the shocking amounts of sewage that are being pumped into our waterways. Everywhere you look, the cuts in everywhere you look. The problems are absolutely immense. And the government has lately, or senior members of government have lately concerned themselves with trying to confiscate the tents of homeless people and ban certain types of lanyards from government buildings. It's as if they're not just nibbling at the edges of problems that we all face. It's as if they're nibbling at the edges of non-existent problems on a completely different planet from the one that we all inhabit. So where am I going with this, you may well ask? And for once, I can tell you. I want to know, because you think about the size of the height of these mountains that I've just described to you. What would it take to get the housing market under control? What would it get to get the NHS back to where it was in 2010, when patient satisfaction was the highest it had been since records began? What will it take to get the prisons fit for purpose? What will it take to get the schools back to where they were in 2010? What will it take to get shoplifting regarded as a crime again, something that you can actually realistically expect to get your collar felt for doing, and shopkeepers will feel protected? What will it take for a GP appointment to be a relatively run-of-the-mill, booking a GP appointment to be a relatively run-of-the-mill affair? What will it take for going into hospital and having a baby being a relatively straightforward, or even perhaps, dare I say, pleasant experience? And you think about what Keir Starmer, if he is Prime Minister this time next year, you think about what he's going to have to do. You sort of begin almost to have a panic attack. I mean, where do you even start with this mess? And it occurred to me this morning that almost all the stories I look at as contenders for our conversations can be filed into two categories at the same time. Question number one is, how did it get so bad so quickly? So just think about that list that I just ran through there. They've only been in power for 14 years, not 40. How did they manage to fluff everything up so completely in such a relatively short amount of time? Right? I kind of know the answers to that. Arrogance, austerity, entitlement, incompetence, prioritising the needs of billionaire donors over the needs of mere voters. I kind of know the answer to that, but I don't know the details. The answer isn't going to be exactly the same when you're talking about schools as it is when you're talking about maternity wards. But the question we need to start asking, and, you know, I've written a book called How They Broke Britain, and the question I get asked most at book events, and there's one in Glasgow on Friday night, which I'm looking forward to. It'd be nice to get up to Glasgow. The question I'm asked most at those events is, how do we fix it? And I don't know, really. If I did, I'd probably be wrapped in ermine somewhere, being consulted like Yoda on a regular basis to fix what appears to be impossible. But that's the question that I get asked the most, and it's time to stop glossing over it, isn't it? It's time to stop glossing over it. How hard is it going to be to fix maternity services? So You know, and I know how bad it is. You know that the trauma has been caused by mistakes and failures made before and during labour. You know that the massive, massive majority of the men and women on these wards will be even more harrowed by these stories than we are. The idea that you join the NHS, that you sign up to be a gynecologist or a midwife or a nurse on a maternity ward, without wanting to provide the best service you possibly can, and now you are reduced to presiding over a situation in which 1 in 3 women who have a child in England endure a traumatic birth. And one of the reasons we didn't talk about this yesterday was because I couldn't. I found it traumatic just talking about it, listening to some of the callers that Nick took and Sheila took. You just found yourself thinking, holy moly, how did it get so bad? So let's do both of those today in the very specific, and I can't do this every day because it is an unleavened diet of misery, if you like. But it's not misery, it's evidence-based analysis. That's why the Prime Minister calling it doomsterism is so scary. Where does he live, Rishi Sunak, if he doesn't think there are very, very, very serious grounds for deep concern and misgivings about the state of the nation? Where does he flipping live? But let's just pick on one area. Let's just pick on maternity wards, okay? 14 minutes after 10 is the time. And let's do this, okay? How did it get so bad so quick? So my youngest is 16. Crikey. My youngest is 16, so that is 2 years before the Conservatives came to power. And going to the hospital to have a baby was not as easy or as patience the wrong word, mother-led as it was in 1971. I heard a woman on the radio yesterday talking about what happened in 1971. And I couldn't believe my ears. I'll tell you a little bit more about that after the junction. But the experience 16 years ago was fine, okay? It was pretty good. No complications, relatively straightforward, second child, so we knew what was going on. In the space of my daughter's lifetime, maternity care in England has gone off a catastrophic cliff. I want you to tell me why. 0345 6060973 from either within or without. As a patient, as a mother, it's not patient, and giving birth is not a medical procedure. I've already misspoken once today. It can become a medical procedure if something goes wrong, of course. But how has it gone so badly wrong so quickly? 0345 6060973. And how hard is it going to be to get it back to roughly where it was in 2010? Because the more I look at what Keir Starmer is going to have on his plate, and you have to presume he's not going to fiddle while Rome continues to burn. He's not going to get into Downing Street and start talking about lanyards and confiscating homeless people's tents. He is going to try to get this stuff fixed. How hard is it going to be? How are you going to fix it? So how did things go so wrong so fast in the very specific context of maternity wards? And I will, of course, hear some of your stories about just how bad it can be. And how the hell? How on earth? Because this is the big elephant in the room for me now. Is some of the damage that the Tories have done over the last 14 years, is that done forever now? You see Rishi Sunak dancing around, complaining about Keir Starmer and talking gibberish about doomsterism. Some of the stuff they've done, some of the stuff he and the previous 4 prime ministers have presided over, is that baked in now? Is that going to be the new Britain? Is that Brexit Britain, where you can't have a baby without having a traumatic experience, where you can't go for a swim in the sea without encountering rivers of poo? Is that it now? That's the question no one asks, because the answer is so dispiriting. But let's focus on maternity wards. How come? So bad so fast. And what does fixing it even begin to look like? If you hit the numbers now, you will get through. 0345 6060973 is the number that you need. It's 18 after 10. 20 minutes after 10 is the time. And obviously, I'm not going to do this every day, but the list is interesting, right? And you start to think of the things that you could realistically describe as broken. And it's only Tuesday. It was maternity wards yesterday. It's prisons today. But let's zone in on the first one. So far, so fast. I like that phrase. You've probably noticed. How did we fall so far, so fast? And how do we get back up again? George is in Hitchin. George, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi there.
Hello, mate.
It's a pleasure to talk to you.
Well, hang on. I mean, it's only let's give it 5 minutes and see how we feel at the end.
I do apologise. I'm a little bit nervous. It's the first time I've called it. So
it's only me.
Right. So the reason I picked up the phone is because I have a daughter. She's currently 4 years old.
Yes.
She was born in the first week of the first lockdown. So obviously that has a certain play to it, you know. But
yes.
In relation to the actual birth, it went on for about 18 hours in total. The first midwife who came in didn't really have a clue what was going on, and she was there for 12 hours. And it was to the point where she didn't know what medication my partner could have. And when I sort of questioned this, she had to go and find a supervisor, and this went on for ages. And then eventually another midwife took over when her shift ended, and she was absolutely brilliant, and I can't fault the second midwife at all.
Right.
But
that's a lottery, right? That's a roulette wheel. You go from and you know, I'll take your word for it that the first one wasn't up to sniff. She might have a slightly different interpretation of events, but it doesn't matter. You didn't feel safe, and then the new midwife arrived, and you felt at least looked after.
Yeah, exactly. But my main point actually is afterwards. So after obviously the birth had happened, we had our baby. You know, we had one health visitor come round about 2 weeks later, and then we never heard from the NHS again after that, which I thought was quite shocking. But after that happened, we over the course of the last 4 years, my partner was pregnant twice, and both.
Was there nothing on the telly? Was there nothing on the telly, George?
Well, it was during COVID, you see.
Fair enough.
But no, she fell pregnant twice, but she had 2 ectopic pregnancies, and we went back and forward from the hospital. We actually did end up losing both babies, but
so
my main thing was during that whole process that we had no support. We kept going back and forward from the hospital. They wouldn't contact us. They sent us away.
You're on your own.
We was on our own completely. They sent us away, and we actually had to tell them the first time there was an ectopic pregnancy and refused to leave the hospital because they was trying to tell us that she's just pregnant and she's getting cramps and that all she can have is paracetamol.
So my youngest is 12 years older than your child, and and listen, the two anecdotes, they're not data make. But the difference, and your experience is widespread. I know it's no consolation to you, but 1 in 3 women have endured a traumatic birth. What do you, as a nice, generous but almost betrayed person, feel the reason is? What would you point at and say that because you know whether they're competent or not, no one joins this profession to do harm, do they? Or you know.
Yeah, no.
What do you think it is? What do you think it is?
I think a lot of it comes down to a lack of communication, but you can only really go down to, you know, when you take that a step further, it's if there's a lack of communication, that means there's a lack of staff. You know,
and that's going to be morale and money.
Of course it is, and I think a lot of it is lack of senior staff as well, because there is a lot of young people in the hospitals, and I'm not saying they're not competent at their jobs, but you'd want somebody who'd want to check everything, you know, and just not.
Well, also someone who's got the time and the space to check everything, rather than someone who's. I'm thinking of a boat, and it doesn't matter whether you're the captain or the cabin boy. If the water is pouring in through various holes, all of you are going to be dedicating your time to bailing the boat out instead of concentrating on what might be your duties during normal time. Thank you, George. It was a great debut. I'm sorry that you were so well qualified to make such a powerful contribution, and not for the first time this week. I'm turning into that kid in The Sixth Sense. So it's not. I'm seeing sort of patterns, because it could be the same phone-in about the police. Why is the experience of policing declined so much? Well, experienced people are leaving, new people are coming in who are less qualified, much less experienced. The job is being done less satisfactorily, and there are huge shortages. George, thank you. And Andrea is in Spalding in Lincolnshire. Andrea, what made you pick up the phone?
Good morning, James.
Hello.
First-time caller, so long-time listener.
That's it. Well done.
Show.
You got the catchphrase right. Welcome aboard.
That's right. Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm ringing up because I've been a midwife now 20 years.
Right.
And obviously I've seen lots of changes that have happened over that 20 years. And I think when I was first looking to becoming a midwife, it was more seen as a vocation.
Yes.
It was hard to get into midwifery. You know, for every one place, you'd have like 150 applicants.
Why was that?
I think because it was seen as a niche market, it's different to nursing. You know, I have every respect for nurses.
Of course, but being a midwife is a very different proposition entirely. What drew you to it?
Just that need and that desire really to be able to support women through a really, really vulnerable time in their life.
What a wonderful answer. What a beautiful answer. What a lovely person. And over the course of that 20 years, you're in the middle of telling me that something shifted.
Yeah.
What?
I think one of the biggest mistakes that the government ever made was removing the bursary and the free fees for nurses and midwives.
Because it attracts a different type of candidate now?
Absolutely. You don't really need to have any vocation about you. I think you just, as long as you can afford your £9,000 a year in tuition fees, well, actually then,
But why? Just help me out a bit with this.
Yeah.
I don't doubt you because you've given it a lot more thought than I have. But why? I mean, would you have been less likely to join up if the bursary wasn't there?
Potentially, but then the way I looked at it, you were giving yourself to a lifelong career of commitment and empathy and care, and
whereas now it feels more transactional. Yeah.
It's sort of like, okay, what do you want to do at university? I'll do midwifery.
Okay, and how does that translate? I don't know what the correct on the wards. That's it. I nearly said on the shop floor, which wouldn't have been quite right.
Well, we do call it shop floor.
Do you? Oh, good. So how does that translate in terms of colleagues? And I know that you're too nice to denigrate them directly, but what do you notice in terms of the difference between people that qualified when you did and, say, people that qualified 5 years ago?
I think that we newer colleagues that I see, I think they reach burnout quicker. They have less resilience.
Okay. Because their calculations have been made in a much more mathematical fashion than yours were. This groundswell. That's why I started by. It's almost like I know what I'm doing, Andrea. It's why I started by asking what drew you to it, and you reached for things that perhaps don't come into play as much for more recent recruits, because as you've said, you're just going through a list of options in a careers office. So they don't understand the value of empathy or a bedrock of altruism or vocation or wanting to do something for reasons other than measurable material reward.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And that would explain. And then, of course, there's short staffing. So you've got that double whammy of less committed staff, for want of a better word, and also fewer staff.
Yeah, because I think really we're not very good at workforce planning either.
No.
So what you end up having is you're having a group of midwives within a certain age bracket that are very closely all together. So therefore, will be leaving the service around about similar sort of times. And there is nobody to backfill it, because what's happening is we're bringing in a younger workforce, which is great, but then we're not treating them the way we need to, so they're burning out quicker.
Got it. They're being overburdened and not supported.
Yeah, overburdened, and then within 5 years they're leaving the profession. And then we've got nobody to replace it.
And that is why the next question I'm almost frightened to ask, is it fixable?
I think it is fixable, but we've just got to have a different type of vision to what maternity is, and like
got to go back to the future.
Yeah, we've got to go back. We have actually got to rewind. We have then got to put, like I say, when I wanted to be a midwife, it was so difficult. We used to have the nursing,
yes,
the lead nurse from the college come in and say, please don't try to apply to get into midwifery because you will never get in. So therefore you're like, right, I'm going to try then.
Oh, how interesting. Interesting.
But now, there was always a desire to
you needed
something
a bit different in order to go down that path, and because you can't put a financial price on it, the current political leadership didn't know how to value it, or didn't value it, perhaps. I'll read you what Sarah says. What an eloquent woman. How wonderful. This is actually the point. It's about people caring, and caring is not a commodity in the sense that you've described it, Andrea.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
But
I've got to go.
Okay.
I'm late for the news, mate. Seriously.
Well,
it's 10:32. You haven't always been in Spalding, have you? Where did you grow up?
No, I am actually from your neck of the woods.
I thought so. You're making me homesick.
From Redditch originally.
There it all goes.
Then,
I see that. I'd have said, yeah. I'd have spotted that. I'd have probably had a guess at Redditch or Bromsgrove accent-wise. Thank you, Andrea. 10:32 is the time. Thomas Watts has your headlines. 10:35 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where I didn't know this today. I didn't know it was being published today, but there's a pamphlet being published by Gordon Brown and Tom Clark. It's called Partnership to End Poverty, Summoning a Coalition of Compassion to Get Britain Through the Poverty Crisis. And this is looking at the families that are struggling to make ends meet. You'd put them on this list as well, wouldn't you? Or you'd put them in this space that we're discussing today. Although we're looking at maternity wards, we were well into double figures when we started listing other areas of our lives that are the responsibility of government, and which we would consider to have been catastrophically damaged over the last 14 years. And that's another one. And the question of how do you fix it, Gordon Brown writing at some length today in a pamphlet published this morning about what roots back to what things used to be like. It's a mad political proposition, that when you think of how much of our media is dedicated to blowing smoke up the backsides of, well, David Cameron and then Theresa May, less so Theresa May actually, but David Cameron and then Boris Johnson and then Liz Truss. Everyone tries to pretend that 49 days was an aberration. Remember, the Daily Mail front page said, finally a true Tory budget. The Daily Telegraph were struggling to contain their excitement at it all. The Institute of Economic Affairs was doing a lap of honour around every studio in the country. And 49 days later, she was chased out of Parliament in abject disgrace, and everyone suddenly started pretending it had nothing to do with them. And subsequently, Rishi Sunak. So most of our media dedicated to blowing smoke up their backsides, and yet the state of the country is such that it's hard to think of an area that is not in need of revolutionary reform, if you're looking at it from one side. But most of us would probably just take, if it was on offer, can we just go back to how things were in 2010? And remember, in 2010, we were coming off the back of a global financial crisis. But you would expect to get your collar felt for shoplifting. You'd be able to get a GP appointment relatively straightforwardly. Patient satisfaction rates in the NHS were the highest they had ever been. Our prisons seemed to be operating, well, functioning in a way that they are not now. You certainly could have a baby in hospital without expecting or having a 33% chance of being traumatized. Everywhere you could swim in the rivers, you could swim in the seas without encountering mysterious clouds of brown goo. You could do all sorts of things just in 2010. Certainly in 2007, if you want to go pre-global financial crisis. So that you'd take that. Can you campaign on that ticket? Vote for me and I'll take you back to 2010. Sam's in Medway. Sam, what made you pick up the phone?
Thanks, James. It's the first time, so bear with me.
Of course I will. Well, I will bear with you. I'll also interrupt you in an incredibly irritating fashion,
fine.
Probably, but I always try not to and then fail.
I do find it entertaining when you do that, so it's fine. So essentially, as I said to your producer, I am a healthcare professional, but I've also been at the receiving end of a traumatic delivery twice. And both times, so unfortunately in 2009, lost our son at 24 weeks.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And I discovered that post-loss that, during actually, I should say, I had originally, so I work in one trust, and I went to my neighbouring trust instead because I wanted a bit of privacy, being, that I didn't want my colleagues to be prodding me and poking me.
Okay.
So during my 20-week scan, I was they said to me, we're doing a new study to look at the length of cervix, because obviously there's a correlation between the length of cervix and how long and the delivery. So we're just trying out, because statistically 25% of all miscarriages happen in the second trimester, and of those, sort of 20% of those happen because of short cervix, so 25% happen because of a short cervix. And this could be for a multitude of reasons. So they were doing a study, and I said, I'm always up for a study. I'm a healthcare professional.
Yes.
Go ahead. And so the sonographer looked at it and said, let me just get my colleagues to have a look. So called his supervisor. They both whispered in the corner while my husband and I sort of kind of sat there. I started to get really nervous because obviously that always isn't very good.
No, and you know that, of course. Most of us think we know it, but you actually know it.
That's it. So they sort of said I was one of the last scans of the day, and they said, we've noticed there's a little bit of funneling at the top of the cervix. So we'd like you to go to day unit and be checked out by the doctors. So they transferred me over to the day unit, maternity day unit. Didn't get seen. So by 8 o'clock, couldn't be seen. Had then to be transferred to a labour ward. They then said by about 10:30, I finally got to a room and to see a registrar who prodded me and poked me and said, they haven't put any measurements on this, doesn't mean anything. I don't notice anything. Off you go. So then I said, I'm on my, I work in a hospital. I'm on my feet all day. Do you think I should take it easy? No, it's fine. Off you go.
So this is left hand, right hand, not knowing.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry.
So then, 48 hours later, I could barely walk. And I just felt really weird. Baby sat really down on the pelvic, my pelvis. And sort of, I said to my husband, I don't feel right. We need to, something's wrong. But this time I decided to go back to the trust I worked in, the people I knew. And I said to them, I just feel such heaviness, like something's sat on my bladder.
This isn't right.
Yeah, something's not right. So they sort of said, well, no, it should be fine. Hadn't sort of kind of put me on the bed. The consultant who I knew sort of chatted away with me, left the registrar to have a look. And he wasn't even gone 2 minutes. The registrar said to the midwife, go and get him. So it all kind of, what can I say? It just kind of went downhill. I was in hospital for 3 weeks. They tried to do what's known as a rescue stitch. But, the moral of the story of that one is they, the sonographers picked something up long before. It was much more preventable if they had actually listened to each other.
And what would you, and you can be as caustic or as generous as you like, but what would you attribute that failure to? The
arrogance of the registrar, who essentially looked at, and if this happens, so I'm not a doctor, so there is a level of, we know better. And it was, so there was a full investigation, and the trust called my husband and I in and told us that, there's so much learning. We've changed the procedure. You should have never been sent home. You should have actually been rescanned, the following morning and had a full investigation to see. There was also other tests that could have been done, those particular swabs and things for hormones. Those all should have happened immediately after the sonographer had identified this issue. This is the whole reason they were doing this particular study, is to pick up women who had issues before it became a problem. And so that, and that was it. And so there was a learning. They promised us that, a change has happened. And hopefully, my hope is that obviously it didn't happen to any other family. And then obviously I spoke to your producer in 2016. My daughter, bless her, she's bouncing, or I should say 7-year-old, very, very loud and chatty 7-year-old now. She unfortunately get the same issue. I always have to have stitches and things put in, so I'm always high risk. But it was picked up. She wasn't growing, and I loved the doctors, the consultant. I always stayed with the same trust afterwards. Who said, Sam, we're not doing this again. We need to kind of get you in. So they decided to deliver her early, which is fine. But what I ended up with, as I was saying, during the day, I had this amazing midwife who I knew. We had a very lovely day together. And obviously she finished her shift at 8:00. I ended up with a locum midwife who didn't know the hospital, who didn't know my history. So my file always has a butterfly on it to show that I've had pregnancy loss.
Yes.
So, she didn't understand. She didn't know what
because
the care
different
plan
hospitals
was.
use different codes.
That's it. So, exactly. And so she then didn't understand the care plan. So my baby was being delivered at 35 weeks. NICU had to be notified. The paediatric team needed to be there when she was delivered. I was telling her through the whole thing what needs to happen. And essentially, she ended up pulling the cord, the emergency cord, 3 times for one delivery between 8:30 p.m. and midnight. And the worst part of it, my baby arrived, thankfully, with the consultant being called in for the second alarm. And then they took her away. I sent my husband off with her because I said, I'm fine. You just, you look after her, because they had to take her to NICU to make sure she was okay. They then sort of said to me, I was left on my own with this midwife. And I just kept saying to her, I'm still getting contractions. She said, no, it's fine. You'll be fine. You'll be fine. She went off, and I called her back again, and I said, look, I'm bleeding. Something's not right here. And she sort of said to me, no, it's fine. This is normal. No, I've delivered. This is my 3rd delivery. Yeah. I'm telling you, this is not normal. And she said, no, it's fine. And, I know, she said, every pregnancy is different. And it's really strange, like I said to you, your producers, like, as a healthcare professional, sometimes you defer, especially when you're a patient. So you sort of kind of take a back seat and say, okay, they know what's happening.
On this occasion, you didn't. You knew.
No, I knew there was something wrong. Then I ended up losing 3 litres and ended up in theatre almost at the brink of death.
And 4 to 5% of the women who have a traumatic
I had a massive hemorrhage.
End up with PTSD, which I don't think is going to come as any surprise at all to you or to anybody listening.
No, not at all.
I've literally got to go, Sam.
Go.
But how long is it? I mean, as from someone inside the NHS, how long is the road back to relative competence, functionality?
There needs to be a massive injection in terms of making it accessible for training. This locuming business isn't working for the NHS, and the reason healthcare professionals go to locuming is because it's more financially rewarding than being a permanent staff member. And so
root and branch reform and taking out some of those options that are not helping anybody really, I suppose, except the shareholders in the agencies and some of the staff that are working, as you say, for the agency. Sam, thank you. I'm sorry I have to hurry, but I'm 3.5 minutes late for this. It is 10:51 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I don't deserve you. I really don't. Not just the calls, of course, but the texts as well. Listen to this. This is detailed. It's eight tweets long from No Hostages. How did it get so bad so fast in the UK, James? Easy to answer. Tories promoted and governed based on 7 terrible ideas. The result is a fractured society, economic turmoil and growing discontent. And those 7 ideas... I'll retweet this so you can see it for yourself, so I won't read you every syllable. The 7 ideas are: some people are better than others. That's the rich man in his castle, the poor man in his gate. Idea 2, the neoliberal approach to services and benefits is sensible. That's how you end up hollowing out the NHS and social care and schools. Number 3, the world is just. We're back to the rich man in his castle. God ordered their estate. Foreigners are malicious. That's number 4. That's been huge since 2015. The wokerati want to destroy Britain. That's been the mother of all distraction tactics. The union is precious. That might be a slightly more nuanced position for many people, but it's certainly worth reading. And number 7, this is huge. The UK is exceptional. So much of the damage that's been done to this country has been caused by exceptionalism. The belief that, oh no, they won't treat us like they treat other people, or the belief that, no, they'll do things differently because we're English. Extraordinary, really, to look back on all of the claims that sort of Project Fear couldn't possibly happen because, excuse me, I think you'll find we're British. And here we are. 10:53 is the time. Charlie's in Saltash in South Cornwall. Charlie, what would you like to say?
Hi.
Hello.
So, like your previous 2 callers, I'm also a healthcare professional. I think it's really interesting that we're all calling in.
Yes.
So I'm a radiographer. I started my training in 2012. So I've seen the NHS through the last 12 years now. But I'm also pregnant at the moment, so I'm experiencing maternity care firsthand. I think that the main problem with maternity care and with the whole of the NHS, it comes down to staffing. And I know people say it all the time, but when you are working on the shop floor, it's so blatantly obvious that the lack of staffing is the root cause of all the problems.
Yeah.
It means that staff can't have adequate breaks. They can't be relieved for training in order to undertake CPD, which is a requirement of being a registered professional. We have to undertake continued professional development in order to make sure we stay current with research and techniques. And we don't get the time to do that. We become burnt out. We get asked to pick up every single extra shift. And I know it's the same across maternity care because I have friends that are midwives.
So, I mean, it's a clumsy analogy, but I think it works. You're all so busy bailing out the boat to stop it sinking that you haven't really got any time to get on with what would be your duties in normal circumstances.
Yeah, basically. And I think that especially now that I'm pregnant and I'm experiencing maternity care firsthand, I'm seeing how different things are now because of the lack of resources and staffing. So my booking appointment, which is your very first appointment with a midwife, you know, you find out you're pregnant, you have to just deal with it on your own, and then you speak to a midwife for 8 weeks. That's now being undertaken over the phone.
Oh, blimey. This is your first baby, is it?
It is, yeah.
Can I ask you a slightly odd question?
Okay.
How old's your mum?
She'll be, she's just turned 59.
Okay. So it's a bit young for this process. But I mean, her experience compared to yours is going to be chalk and cheese.
Yeah.
But I was listening yesterday to a mother who'd given birth in 1971.
Okay.
And I couldn't believe it. Do you know that with a first baby, you'd stay in hospital for about a week? Just being shown how to do everything and being looked after and making sure there weren't any complications, and also sparing you from having to go home and do other things and duties, and the care you got from the midwife and the healthcare visitor. And I heard Maria Caulfield being interviewed about it, and she couldn't make sense of how far we'd fallen. She made some meaningless platitudes about, well, things are more complicated now. How can things be more complicated now? But
the functionality of having a baby has remained the same, like you said earlier.
That's very controversial, Charlie. It's biology.
Mothers are not patients.
No, exactly.
The physiological birth has unfortunately become not the norm. Over 50% of births in the UK are now caesarean sections.
Right.
And whilst caesarean sections are absolutely life-saving in certain situations, they're also being done when they don't need to be. And so physiological birth is now not the norm, which means that we're opening ourselves up to higher risks.
So we should have higher care, not lower. But I suppose I don't want to. Are you working in there? So there's nothing I can say that's going to open your eyes to something that you don't know already. But how do you account for the speed of the decline?
That's an interesting one, I think, because in 2012, when I first started my training, I was fresh out of school. I was 18 years old, and I had an absolute passion for my chosen career.
Yes.
I'd always wanted to do, like the midwife who phoned in earlier was saying, it was a true vocation. I benefited from the tuition fee loan and bursary. The NHS paid for my travel to and from my placement sites, which meant I didn't have to worry about any of that whilst I was at university, and it meant I could truly focus on becoming a well-rounded professional in my chosen vocation.
Right.
Now that that's not possible, the students that I'm seeing, I'm well aware it's not in maternity care, it's a different profession.
Of course.
But the students that I see don't have that same level of desire, commitment and vocation that we used to have.
They've taken that out because you can't put a price on it. I know I keep coming back to that point, but I will keep coming back to it until someone gives me an alternative analysis that fits the facts as well. And the question I hesitate to ask is how hard will it be to get back to where we were in, say, 2012 or 2010?
It's massively hard because we've got to a point where professionals are suffering so much from compassion fatigue. The only way to get over that is to leave the profession or take a break.
Which makes everything worse.
Of course, and it means that the people left behind are then picking up the pieces, and then they themselves are suffering with being overworked.
And we wonder why people are emigrating to Australia at a rate of knots, don't we? Charlie, good luck with it all. I'm sure it will all go swimmingly, but forewarned is forearmed, isn't it? And I wish you all the very, very best. It's just gone 10:58. Last call on this, I suspect. And I'm quite short of time, so apologies in advance for that. Jenna is in Sevenoaks. Jenna, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Nice to talk to you. I actually completely agree with everything your previous callers just said as well. Coming from experiencing it, the resources just completely aren't there.
And it's hard to blame anyone except because we should be blaming government for this, I suppose. Yeah. But you can't, can you? They're nowhere near the maternity ward when you're pulling the alarm bells or the midwives are dropping the ball.
No, I think my experience, I just had a complete lack of compassion and an apathy from the majority of the midwives.
That's heartbreaking. Isn't it?
I had to deal with I was in labour for 43 hours.
Oh my days.
And I had to deal with about 10 midwives. And I think the lady was a student delivering me. And I think she was a sadist. I'm not going to lie.
Are you serious? Well, this would be the extreme version. I don't know. You laughed first. I don't want to think about a sadistic midwife, but this would be the extremity of what the previous callers have described, including the midwife who was on first, just describing the candidates coming into the profession are just completely different from who was drawn to the profession before.
Yeah, I'm kind of not really sure why she wanted to go into that profession.
No, because she didn't do much when she was with you to display the kind of attributes that we would ordinarily associate with that job.
No, I was forced onto my back 4 times and into stirrups by her because I was wanting to give birth upright and she wasn't letting me. Yeah. I wasn't given any pain relief throughout the 43 hours because they didn't believe I was in active labour. It was only when they decided to check my cervix a second time, she said, "Oh, I can feel his head. You can't have any pain relief now. It's too late."
Well, you seem to have kept your sense of humour and your good mood, but what you're describing is traumatic.
Yes, I think it's probably laughing coming from trauma, to be honest.
And there is loads and loads and loads of it about. I did warn you, Jenna, that we were short of time, but that final point about possibly needing to step back a few paces from the idea that everyone's doing their best and they've all joined for all the right reasons. It's such a scary door to open, though, isn't it? But when someone who's been in labour for 43 hours uses the word sadist to describe a midwife, it gives serious pause to this, I think, perfectly well-meaning idea that you shouldn't pick on the professionals because the problem is political. If the politicians have created an environment in which the professionals aren't up to sniff, then I guess there's finger pointing at both to be done. It's 11:01. Something a bit strange happened yesterday. It's funny, when Rishi Sunak gave that speech, I didn't think there was anything in it worth talking about. But when the dust started to settle, I found myself marvelling at some of the things that he said. One of them plays into the conversation we were having in the last hour. Which is worth listening to. And then one of them, I think, would have gone down like a bucket of cold sick in most of Scotland. So just by way of a nod towards the last hour, have a listen to this one.
Extremists are also exploiting these global conflicts to divide us. People are abusing our liberal democratic values, the freedom of speech, right to protest, to intimidate, threaten and assault others, to sing anti-Semitic chants on our streets and our university campuses, and to weaponize the evils of anti-Semitism or anti-Muslim hatred in a divisive, ideological attempt to set Britain against Britain. And from gender activists hijacking children's sex education to cancel culture, vocal and aggressive fringe groups are trying to impose their views on the rest of us. They're trying to make it morally unacceptable to believe something different and undermine people's confidence and pride in our own history and identity. Scottish nationalists are even trying to tear our United Kingdom apart.
I mean, I found that a bit bonkers to begin with, because I can't think of a political period that's been more divisive than the last 8 years. I mean, you've got a Minister for Common Sense waging war on lanyards yesterday. The idea that demonstrating solidarity with LGBTQ people is some sort of political statement takes us right back to the 1950s. But it was the mention of the Scottish nationalists right at the end that I found absolutely, genuinely extraordinary. I don't know why he put them on the list. Russia, Iran, North Korea, anti-Semites and Scottish nationalists seem to be the list that Rishi Sunak was consulting there. I don't know if I can say what is he playing at on this one. I'm confused because he's talking essentially about his own party. All of these divisions have been very careful. He made 30p Lee Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party. This is going to be a phone-in about Scotland, certainly about the SNP and about what Rishi Sunak said in that clip that you just heard. But it's worth reminding ourselves of a bit of context. He made 30p Lee Deputy Chairman of the Conservative Party after 30p Lee said, we can't really fight the election on any substantive issues. We're going to have to fight it on culture war and transgender toilets or transgender issues. So he made the man who said we're going to fight it on culture war issues deputy chairman of the party, and yet he also made a speech in which he essentially tried to cast himself as the oil upon the water of culture war content. I have an odd relationship, as you know, with Scottish independence, because it really is, and I know people don't like it when I point this out, but it really is one of those areas where people don't let you think stuff through in public. My job is thinking stuff through in public, and there are a few issues, sadly, that it is, certainly since the arrival of Twitter, there are a few issues wherein it's almost impossible to just think stuff through in public. And, you know, I'm not expecting anyone to get their violins out, but you say something in passing 10 years ago and it's still haunting you, either with a clip or with a pylon 10 years later, even if you've completely changed your mind. So I just get that front and centre. My current position is that if I was Scottish, I'd find it very hard to want to remain part of a United Kingdom that has treated me with such obvious and abject contempt over the last several years. But I'd also remember that Gordon Brown was Prime Minister not that long ago and that he is Scottish. So it's nuanced. But if I was Scottish, I think I'd be a lot closer to the SNP than I am as someone who's not Scottish. But I also respect sovereignty and respect history and respect the nationalist desire for independence. Scotland as a country has a kind of historic independence. I've been reading a lot about Ireland at the moment in the 17th century, and the way that the British people sought essentially to crush what you would call indigenous existence beneath their boots, to enslave effectively, or certainly to kind of outlaw anything that spoke of Irishness. They succeeded up to a point in Wales where I think they haven't succeeded in other parts of the United Kingdom. But to put Scottish nationalists on that list seems to me to be an absolutely extraordinary intervention. And I think the question I've got for you is, what did you think when you heard it? What did you think when you heard a Tory Prime Minister list Scottish nationalism alongside Russia, Iran, North Korea, anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred as threats to the fabric of our shared existence? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. I don't want this to be I want to entertain the possibility that this is not as offensive as it seems to me to be. So I don't want you to feel that you can't ring in to say, no, he didn't mean what you think he means, James. And it's all very well the Daily Record writing it up as an appalling attack upon everybody in Scotland. But what he really means is this. You can do that. The phone lines are open for that, 0345 6060973. But you give a speech. Just think about this. You give a speech in which I think he genuinely believed he was sounding like a peacemaker. He genuinely believed he was sounding like somebody calling for a departure, if you like, from precisely the sort of culture wars that the bloke he made deputy chairman said were their only chance of campaigning effectively in the next general election. And then he, I mean, to my ears, he insulted anybody who entertains hopes of Scottish independence in the most extraordinary and unnecessary way. And remember, these speeches are written days in advance. It's not like this show. He doesn't just turn up and start talking and then wonder sometimes what on earth he was thinking when he let that come out of his mouth. He has deliberately sought to alienate, in, I would argue, a profoundly offensive fashion, anybody who is currently drawn to the SNP. And I genuinely don't understand why. And that's why I mentioned the fact that these speeches are written days in advance and they're pored over by various aides and advisors, and they are delivered, in this case, at a secretly funded think tank, would you believe? And you think I exaggerate about these matters. But the question of how offensive it is the one that you answer by giving me a call to tell me what you felt when you heard Scottish nationalism being listed alongside Russia, Iran, North Korea, anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred. Or to tell me that the Daily Record have got this wrong and that's not how you heard it at all. That's why I played you the full clip. So question number one is about the impact upon you personally. But question number two is again, this sort of theme that emerges on so much of what the Tories are doing at the moment, where you find yourself looking at it. Last time I think I said this out loud, we were talking about Suella Braverman and the tent. I could do a phone in every day saying, what the hell are they playing at? What is that designed to achieve? Do you see what I mean? We're going to confiscate homeless people's tents because there's too many homeless people sleeping in tents. What on earth? Who is the audience that this is designed to appeal to? And I want to do the same today with these comments from Rishi Sunak. What is this designed to achieve? So it can't be accidental. It's not off the cuff. It's not something that happened because he didn't realise his microphone was still on. It's a deliberate attempt to somehow associate evil regimes in Russia, Iran, North Korea and elsewhere with Scottish nationalism. And the calculation must be that there is a constituency to whom this will appeal. Labour, in the opinion polls, and you're perfectly entitled to think opinion polls are a load of old hokum until they go in your favour, in which case we all suddenly decide they're brilliant again. But the opinion polls have Labour now enjoying a bigger lead in Scotland than they have done in a very, very long time. There's disarray at the top of the SNP, however, whichever way you cut it. And the Conservative Prime Minister of the United Kingdom has sought to essentially associate anybody in favour of Scottish independence with Russia, Iran, North Korea, anti-Semites and anti-Muslim hatred. And I don't understand why. So there's a question about how offensive this is, which I think is a question worth asking. And I do stress again, I would quite like you to answer that question by saying it's not actually that offensive at all, James. What you have to understand is ... And then the second question becomes, what's the plan here? You know how he always says Keir Starmer hasn't got a plan and he's got a plan. What's the plan here? What is the subtext? The secret potion? The plan, the plot? What does he hope to achieve by aligning Scottish nationalism with Russia, Iran, North Korea, anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred? What do you think? And your guess is as good as mine at this point in proceedings, but if you follow Scottish politics a little more closely than I do, then you may do you do a considerably better job than I can. Because right now I haven't got a Scooby-Doo, as they say in Scotland. I haven't got a Scooby what he's trying to achieve. Make that list of things. It's a stupid speech anyway. You're the kings of the culture war. You invented it. and now you're claiming that you want to move away from it. That's just daft, but that's communal garden daft. That's normal service daft. This is very different. This is potentially dangerous daft. Why has he done it? And what did you feel? What did you think when you heard him do it? It's 15 minutes after 11. The number you need is 0345 6060 973. It's 18 minutes after 11. In some ways, it's worse than I precede. Westminster correspondent at STV News has put it together rather nicely, by which I mean pithily. There's nothing nice about the story. But the dangers that the country face, the list starts with Russia, Iran, North Korea and China, and it ends with Scottish nationalism, but it gets there via Houthis, hackers, mass migration, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim hatred and gender activism. So how did you feel when you heard your Prime Minister, and I know those words grate a bit, line you up alongside Russia, Iran, North Korea and anti-Semitism, and why do you think he's done it? Errol is in Edmonton, which is not in Scotland, but we won't hold that against you. Errol, what would you like to say?
I think it's very befitting of our politics at the moment that somebody that may want independence of Scotland is put in the same bracket.
I think the phone, I just lost the phone line then. Just go back to put in the same bracket. Tell me what you mean.
To be just putting them in the same conversation, putting Scottish nationalists and people that want independence of Scotland or for any country in the same bracket as somebody that feels
but it's traffic stoppingly crass. I mean, even more so when you look at it alongside Houthi rebels. And hackers, mass migration, anti-Semitism, and Scottish nationalism, and it sticks out to me like a sore thumb. I mean, it's also incredibly divisive. I'm giving a speech about the need to be less divisive, and by the way, Scottish nationalists, you're basically Houthi rebels. I don't get it. Maybe I'm the one being daft. Errol, thank you. Alex in Fife. Alec, what do you reckon?
It's quite a simple play for destroying the SNP, the Labour vote by forcing everyone across to the SNP.
So everybody, this has been a lesson for me recently in part of the SNP's travails caused possibly by the focus upon their raison d'etre and
yes,
not.
Well, you've got two progressive parties and one regressive, reactionary party, which has got no traction in Scotland whatsoever. So he's basically trying to rescue the Tory party from being, from coming third behind the SNP in the national elections, and the SNP could become the official opposition.
So he's electioneer while comparing them to Russia, Iran, and North Korea. He's actually electioneering for the SNP.
Yeah.
I think that's hard to resist that as an analysis. Will it work?
Yeah.
Do you think so?
Yeah.
Why?
Well, there's two choices.
Yeah.
People don't really like Starmer because they don't know him.
No, I don't mean that. I mean, will this gambit work? So if we look at where the numbers are now...
I don't think it's going to make any great numbers, but it's going to happen anyway. So there's going to be about 10% for the Tories, I reckon.
And how dangerous is it, Alec? How dangerous is it for the UK Prime Minister to list people who want Scottish independence alongside the vilest regimes on the planet?
He doesn't care. He cares about nothing. So he doesn't care. I mean, he puts Philip P. Lee in, he's got Suella Braverman. He doesn't care about people. So why would he care about Scotland?
And how offensive was it to you personally?
It's more of the same, isn't it?
I don't think it is. Well, you're following it more closely than I am. But this one, and it's not more of the same, because even in Scottish media, the reaction has been shock. There's been shock.
Okay. He's actually put into words how we've treated, almost. It's like,
so he said the quiet part out loud, is what you mean?
Yeah, 100%. It's like, there you go.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, I like the idea of it being I don't like the idea, but I can make sense of the idea that it's an electoral gambit. We've given up on winning any votes in Scotland. So here I'm going to say something that might actually tempt some people to come back into the SNP fold who are currently flirting with Labour because they're so outraged and offended by what I a Conservative Prime Minister have said. Andy takes it a little more easily, just says he's done it because he's really bad at politics. Tam Maguire says he's done it to set the country on fire, James. He knows they're out, and this is a parting gift, the last bite of a dying dog. And he can't... I don't know if I like references to his sartorial get-up, Linda, but I'll read it out on this one occasion. He can't even buy the right-sized clothes, let alone save the world. 23 minutes after 11 is the time. Daniel's in Abbot. Daniel, what's going on?
Hi, James.
Hello.
This is the first time I've ever phoned up to yours or any other phone-in thing, really.
What happened? What was it that made you sort of think today's the day?
Well, I'm part of the LGBTQ plus community.
Right.
And I'm really, really sick to death of conservatives using trans people as a punching bag and a doormat and a scapegoat for all their faults and problems.
And that's what you heard yesterday?
Yeah. And the Scottish nationalist thing, well, they say the same thing about Welsh nationalists. They say things like, when an English person walks into a pub, we all speak Welsh on purpose to exclude them. And I'm like, we speak English. We speak English mostly in this country. Not many people actually speak Welsh, like, every day. But it's just that kind of, it's the othering of people, isn't it?
I think so. How shocking was it? Because, I mean, I don't think of Welsh independence or Scottish independence. Some of the debate, particularly around the time of the referendum in Scotland, was quite toxic. It was very heated. But the planet on which you'd think of putting it on the same list as the thing, I double-checked this morning, Daniel, because I thought, am I overreacting to this? Am I missing the point? Am I thinking, I'm joining 2 and 2 and coming up with 5? So I had a proper look at Scottish media this morning, and the sense of outrage is coupled with a sense of befuddlement. Like this question of what on earth is he doing? And part of the answer will be he's trying to push votes back towards the SNP from Labour because he knows he's never going to secure them for himself. But it seems like such an obnoxious and such a potentially dangerous thing to do that I can't quite credit it. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I think it's that possibly strategically he's trying to cut his losses in Scotland by driving people to the SNP just to keep Labour out.
Just to reduce the number of seats that Labour might win up there.
Yeah, it's entirely possible. But I think mostly what we're seeing is after 14 years and how many, 1, 2, 3, 4, God knows how many prime ministers, 14 years and the country is getting worse. The crime is going up. There seems to be a stabbing every week. Unemployment has gone up again.
Crime's coming down. I have to be a bit of a fact checker there. There's a fascinating piece, I forget where, that I read talking about how the actual statistics and the public perception of the statistics are completely at odds with each other. But that's a slight digression. It's arguably one of the few areas where things aren't in obvious decline. But we listed in the last hour the areas where things are in obvious decline.
If you ask a working class person anywhere in Wales, do the Tories make you feel poorer, or do Scottish nationalists or Welsh nationalists make you feel poorer? I think everybody will say it's the Tories. After 14 years of economic mismanagement, corruption, PPE contracts, all sorts of profligate spending and depravity, really, at our expense.
Nicely put, Daniel. And I like the way that you settled into your debut call to the programme so quickly and so easily. But it's still a source of, maybe not wonder to me, but concern, profound concern. The idea that the UK Prime Minister would stand up and add Scottish nationalism to a list of, almost objectively obnoxious institutions or ideas. Russia, Iran, North Korea, anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred. I agree with your comments about transgender people being used as a punching bag, but I've often said that in the area of culture wars, the only bit where descriptions of the febrility of the conversation might be accurate would be there, but it doesn't mean it doesn't mean that there's any case whatsoever for adding Scottish nationalism to a list of nation-damaging issues. I'd take both of them off for the record. I don't quite understand the point that would knit all of those things together. Steve's in Chester. Steve, what would you like to say?
Hello. I'm taking the slightly trepidatious step of disagreeing with you entirely.
Well, do you know what? You've started brilliantly, because trepidatious is one of my favourite words of all time.
Oh good.
So you've softened me up perfectly.
One of mine is spasm, but let's not try and use that. Right, so nationalism and a desire for independence are two separate things. Okay. Nationalism, as that nice chap Mr. Orwell said 80-odd years ago, is a very bad thing, and it is nothing to do with democracy.
Well, he was talking about English nationalism, wasn't he, when he said that?
No.
Or was he talking about nationalism in general?
Was
he?
Yeah. Okay. Read it. It's only about 14 pages.
Sure.
It's worth to read. Anyone SNP voters out there, read it, fellas.
Go on.
Right, so a desire for independence is one thing. I can sort of see it. I've heard you talk about it, and I semi-agree with you.
Yeah.
I'm not English, I'm not Welsh, I'm not Scottish, I'm not Irish, I'm British.
Yes.
I've got grandparents from each of those nations, and British is what I am. So I don't like the footballification. I don't like the flag waving particularly, except the Union flag, which I quite like. But I'm not a gammon. I'm very left in my politics. But nationalism is an enemy of this country, and it's demonstrably so. The Scottish nationalists literally want to stop our country being our country as it is. They want to, on the say-so of a 52-48 vote amongst 7% of the UK population, they think it's okay to literally tear my country apart, change its borders, change its economy, change its relationships with other countries, change its defence, change its security, even change its name and its flag on the say-so of, 2 million people? That's not democracy, and that is in line with the kind of aspirations that you see from people like Mr. Putin and his nasty little cohort. It's the opposite of democracy. Nationalism is not our friend.
Blimey.
Scottish independence is a different thing.
Well, this is where we will...
give us a vote.
Yeah.
Let's do it. But the word nationalism doesn't mean what it is. It's come to me. It's not another word for patriotism.
I don't know if we're splitting hairs here, and I don't think either of us can prevail. But I presumed he meant the SNP, as in the Scottish National Party.
Well, I mean, we could go into a different conversation about what is the Venn diagram between nationalism and SNP voting, and I think
of course we could.
There is a fair bit there of overlap. And I work in the renewables industry. I spent a lot of time in Scotland over the last 5 or 10 years. And depending on what point of the evening you're in the pub, depends on whether that person is the rational arguer of Scottish independence or the shouting nationalist.
So so Sunak appealed to you then?
No,
on this very specific, very
specific point, on that tiny issue. Grudgingly, with my teeth clenched, I have to say... Well,
and trepidatiously.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not going to vote for the bugger, obviously.
No, I understand that. But you think he was... I mean, listen, it's an odd list.
It's something that needs saying, James. It's something that needs saying.
Well, and it's something that you've said very well. It's something that you've said very well. What do you say to people who say it's none of our business? Because I've tried and failed to make some of the points you've made in the past about it being our country.
Scottish people or Irish people, well, it's all right. Go back 350 years. Scotland was a country independent of the non-existent United Kingdom. Go back another 350 years. Galloway was an independent kingdom in what is now Scotland. Taking that sword point by the Scots. Should Galloway be independent? What about Northumberland? What about Wessex? What about Cornwall? I live in Cheshire. It's a county palatine. It used to have its own earl, independent of the king. At what point in history do you want to go back to, but still be a modern country with a democratic intent? It's ridiculous.
Okay, here's the thing, right? I think you make a very powerful and a clearly very well-informed argument, but I don't think that's what Rishi Sunak was doing yesterday.
Well, I mean, I'm better than him, aren't I? I'm better at politics than the Prime Minister, but then again, so's my cat.
So's my sofa. Steve, thank you. I shall listen back to that call because you waded very courageously into waters that are, as I mentioned at the outset, incredibly choppy because there is a deep desire, sometimes an accidental desire not to let people think out loud on these issues. But you've done your thinking clearly before you spoke out loud, and it was. I found it very persuasive. It is 11:32, so Sunak, actually, if you define nationalism according to how George Orwell and others have done, Sunak was making a valid point about those who would do harm to the United Kingdom. And, how else do you describe breaking up the United Kingdom if it's something that you value? How else do you describe that if not as harm? I don't think that's what Sunak meant, though. I don't think he's that clever. It's 11:33. Thomas Watts has your headlines. 11:36 is the time. Absolute twaddle that guy was talking, James, a reference back to Steve. But I can safely say, inevitably perhaps, that the response to that kind of quite impassioned plea for a united kingdom, which obviously entails a rejection of calls for Scottish independence, has divided opinion quite neatly. Jonathan writes, crikey, which pub did Steve say he drinks in? I might be persuaded to pop in for a pint. And Andy knits it all together when he says Steve's cat or James's sofa for Prime Minister. And Tim responds to some of the points Steve made by saying home rule for Wessex. You see, I mean, Steve was making the point in a tongue-in-cheek fashion, but I'm pretty sure the last Marquess of Bath was a big supporter of independence for Wessex. Probably because he thought he'd be in charge. So I don't know if today's the day to open that up a little further and look at what Steve was saying. Look at the concept of Scottish nationalism as an enemy of Britishness. It's a conversation that I think would be absolutely fascinating. But we've got probably enough on our plate today with a conversation about why the Prime Minister put Scottish nationalism alongside Russia, Iran, North Korea, anti-Semitism and anti-Muslim hatred. Indeed, quite a few of you have pointed out that the Conservative Party's ties to Russia, up to and including the decision to put a KGB spy's son in the House of Lords, don't sit very comfortably with Rishi Sunak's words yesterday, although, of course, that elevation into the House of Lords was undertaken before the invasion of Ukraine. So how do you respond to your Prime Minister calling you or describing you as akin to Russia, Iran, North Korea, Houthi rebels, anti-Semites and anti-Muslim hatred? And why did he do it? Why did he do it? Alex is in Banff in Scotland. Alex, what do you reckon?
Good morning, James.
Hello, Alex.
Long time listener, first time caller, and a bit nervous.
There's a lot. Everyone said that today. I wonder why so many people have chosen today to break their ducks. It's very gratifying, and you're very welcome. But there's no need to be nervous.
Okay, thank you. This is just Sunak trying to drive a wedge into the party politics north of the border. He's hoping that if he does enough damage to the SNP vote, then some of those votes will come in the Conservative direction. I think he's not quite got that right, though.
Yeah.
I think that a lot of the votes could go in the Labour direction, but
well, they are currently going in the Labour direction. A previous caller thought that he was trying to steer those votes going towards Labour towards the SNP, but you think he's actually trying to steer them towards himself, towards his own party.
I think he's trying to hope that if he drives a big enough wedge into the Scottish political arena as it sits just now, and the SNP lose votes, he's banking on a proportion of those votes in pretty big Conservative seats in Scotland going to the Conservatives.
Well, it could be.
And then he can point in the direction saying, well, we've increased our vote north of the border.
What did you feel when you heard those? What did you feel when you heard that list?
I thought it was the most heinous thing ever to accuse a country of by comparing it to aggressive foreign countries. We don't want to do anything like that. Scots are a peace-loving people, but to compare us to those countries, absolutely outrageous. But then this is just typical Tory approach. It's don't look over here, look over there. It's look, we're not as bad as this lot who are getting it so badly wrong. And what he's trying to do is tar the Scots with this.
Well, what about Steve's point? With the distinction between nationalism and a desire for independence. So nationalism essentially under that reading would be a kind of support of your own nation's interests, especially to the exclusion or detriment of the interests of other nations. So there's a There's an aggression to nationalism that is not endemic to a desire for independence. So he didn't say Scottish independence campaigners. He said Scottish nationalists.
Yeah, and maybe that could be contrived as being aggressive, but maybe that's what he wants other people within the United Kingdom to consider as well. That the Scottish nationalists are an aggressive bunch of characters, and they're nothing of the sort. They're simply following
a desire for independence. It is, it is,
and in a democratic fashion.
Well, that's true as well. Although, I think Steve's call is going to stay with me for a while. He's sort of opened up avenues of contemplation that I've never really been down before, looking at the statistics, looking at the numbers, looking at the turnout, looking at the size of certainly going back to Brexit, going back to 2016 under my glorious rule, you'd have needed a much bigger margin of victory than the one you actually got to undertake such an extraordinary... I've done that a lot today. Gary's pointed out that my promise to stop saying extraordinary all the time. So it's to stop saying extraordinary an extraordinary amount of times has failed rather in the last 24 hours. I shall get back on that bandwagon imminently. But if it's really going to change the absolute fabric of nation or nations, plural... the size of the margin of victory should probably be bigger than what we would currently accommodate or currently accept. But that's splitting hairs in the context of Alex's point. 11:42 is the time. Rob, I tried to do this, but it's a while since I read it, Rob. He says, stop perverting Orwell. How many radio phone-in shows get messages that begin with the three words, stop perverting Orwell? Not that many, I would cautiously suggest. Notes on nationalism usually usefully clarifies the toxic chauvinism of all nationalism, including Zionism and Stalinism and all the rest of it. I have read it, but not for a while. I don't know whether Steve would apply the phrase toxic chauvinism to Scottish nationalism, but I wouldn't necessarily say that he wouldn't. Let's go to Glasgow next. Alex is there. I'm there on Friday. Alex, what would you like to say?
Yes, thanks for having me on the show. So I'm an SNP councillor in Glasgow.
Okay.
My point around this is the inflammatory nature of the Prime Minister's comments. I mean, some of your other listeners have made the point that the SNP and Scottish independence is a civic nationalist movement, peaceful. There's never been any trouble in that front. And John Swinney was elected our new leader at the Holyrood, new First Minister of Scotland. He talked about polarisation in politics, and we need to bring an end to that. In this Parliament, we've had multiple MPs killed. And it seems to me, particularly from the Prime Minister's podium, that lumping in a viewpoint held by 50% of Scotland, give or take, depending on the poll you're listening to, alongside China, North Korea, Iran, and Putin.
That's what you heard, is it? You heard that. There's no wiggle room for you there. There's no distinction to be drawn between nationalism in the Orwellian sense and support for independence in an electoral sense. You heard your politics being set alongside Vladimir Putin's.
So I would ask the Prime Minister to point to the problematic parts of the nationalism he's talking about. Nationalism is that is part of the Scottish independence campaign, has always been and has been made clear that his civic nationalism is outward looking, it's welcoming.
That word civic is crucial, isn't it? And I should probably have introduced it to this conversation before 11:45.
And unlike the UK, actually, the form of nationalism he is decrying is outward looking, it is accepting of people who need help. It's actually much, much more less of a toxic form of nationalism than what is being pursued by the Tory party and, to an extent, the Labour Party, who are wrapping themselves in the flag. There is another point I was going to make, which I think is quite important here.
Before you do that, why do you think he did it?
I think it was an entirely crude attempt from a failing Prime Minister to bang the drum for his base to motivate them for the election.
Who's his base? Who's the base here on this specific...
Oh, the base on this?
Yeah. Are they English nationalists?
Well,
or British patriots, people who actually do like being British and like being in the United Kingdom. And you would say you've got no right to decide the future of Scotland, and they would say, well, it's not just the future of Scotland, it's the future of the United Kingdom. But that sounds thoughtful and nuanced to me, and I don't think anyone would describe Rishi Sunak's base as thoughtful and nuanced.
No, I wouldn't suggest so. And I mean, there's not much of a difference between patriotism and a civic nationalism.
Crucially, civic nationalism.
Yes, and what these people that are described to this worldview do not understand is, had the entire of the EU required a referendum before Britain left, I think they may have had a slight issue. But the point I was going to make was actually that the thing that is really disgusting me, because this is incredibly inflammatory, and you know, as I said, we've had multiple MPs who've been killed over this Parliament for people not thinking about what they're saying. Okay, as 50% of the Scottish people hold a viewpoint similar to this. You know, so
to malign them in that way is a potentially insightful act.
But the problem I have is we've heard nothing, as far as I'm aware, condemning this from Keir Starmer, the leader of the opposition, or any of his shadow cabinet.
He might be busy. He might be at the doctor's today. I know. I appreciate the. I think that Stephen Flynn does it extremely well. Your equal opportunities criticism of the other two major parties, but I'm not buying that, mate. That you know, Rishi Sunak says something awful, so you're having a pop at Keir Starmer.
Well, I mean. Well, I think it's important. Though.
Maybe, but it's not important enough to take up time on this radio programme, more than you have already. You're perfectly entitled to make your point, but if we all start doing that, why haven't you condemned, I don't know, Esther McVeigh for her nonsense about lanyards yesterday?
I'm not the leader of the opposition.
It doesn't matter. You should have called. You're on live national radio. The floor is yours. Why haven't you condemned Lanyard McVeigh? But no, I will be interested to hear someone ask Keir Starmer a question about that, Alex. But until they do, you can't really have a pop-up. What do you want him to do? Issue a press release? Call a press conference specifically on it? I haven't heard what John Swinney... What's John Swinney said about it?
Political parties release a lot of press releases.
No, but what's John Swinney said? What's John Swinney said about it?
Well, I think condemned it alongside, as far as I'm aware. Are you sure? I don't know.
Are you sure? Do you know for sure that the leader of the SNP has condemned the comments that you're condemning the Labour leader for not condemning?
I think he. Yeah, I think he. I don't know for sure.
No, you don't. So you see, you've got to be careful, haven't you? Who you swing at, because you don't know whether your leader's done it or not, and he was talking about them. But you're here to say that why hasn't Keir Starmer done it? You weren't expecting me to ask that question, were you? But I ask it in fun. I ask it in fun because I'm in Glasgow on Friday night, and I want a guard of honour, Alex. Can you make some calls?
Oh, well, absolutely. I mean, I'll follow you on Twitter. You DM me, and we'll take you to the pub.
I look forward to it. Top man. It's 11:49. I don't know whether John Swinney has condemned it either, but until you are sure that he has, you can't really have a pop at Keir Starmer for not having done so. I would just cautiously contend. It's 11:49. 11:53 is the time, and my apologies, I should have done this sooner. Huge congratulations are in order for Prince William, the Prince of Wales, who has been appointed Colonel-in-Chief of Prince Harry's former regiment, actually, the Army Air Corps. So massive congratulations to William for fighting off all the competition there, and commiserations to all of the unsuccessful candidates, but I'm sure we can all agree that the best man won. And becoming Colonel-in-Chief of the Army Air Corps is a fitting conclusion to a glittering career. So glad to get that out of the way. 11:53 is the time. Back to Glasgow. Billy's there. Billy, what do you reckon? The Prime Minister lumping Scottish nationalism or Scottish civic nationalism, as perhaps we should call it, he didn't, alongside everything from Vladimir Putin apologism right through to the regime in Iran.
I think he just said what he actually really believes. It reminds me of a line. I know it's the Braveheart thing, but there's a line in that film that said, was it Edward Longshanks said, "The trouble with Scotland is it's full of Scots."
And you think that's what Sunak was channeling?
I think so. It's just, I mean, to compare Scottish nationalists to that, I mean, I mean, the Scottish. I mean, there is a Scottish National Party who are the exact opposite of what the Tories are with regard to trying to look after their people, as in progressive policies, things like that. These things that they hate. Our water is obviously there are issues with the water. Not as nowhere near as bad as England. Everything that's not with. Everything we've.
Well, let's not get into that now. And I just say that because I'm glancing at the clock and David in Dundee is waiting to speak. But what do you think Sunak was playing at? I don't let myself do this very often, Billy, because I can't come on the radio every day and say, what do you think a politician is playing at? It's my job to try to work it out. But on this one, the theories have been equally compelling, even as they contradicted each other. So why do you think he did it?
There was one comment you had earlier on. I think it was in a text saying he's just not very good at politics.
Yeah,
I think he's, as I said to your producer, I think he's losing the plot. I think he's actually realising how he's going to be the.
We'll try everything. We'll try absolutely everything. I'm the change candidate, but you've been in power for 14 years. Oh yeah, that's not going to work. We need to be against division, but you've got the most divisive politicians in recent history in your cabinet, and they're all like, that doesn't work. I'm down with the Scottish nationalists. See if that works. Just like that, really.
He's just trying. I mean, what was that Esther McVeigh saying about go lanyards? I'm actually going to go and buy a rainbow lanyard just for the sake of that.
Is Rainbow Lanyard the woman in the Donald Trump court case, or is that someone else? I'm getting Stormy Daniels and Rainbow Lanyard mixed up, I think, this morning. But you should have a listen, if you can, to Henry Riley's encounter with Esther McVeigh yesterday on that subject, because that's what happens when a competent journalist meets an incompetent politician, and it never gets old. Thank you, Billy. From Glasgow to Dundee, David is there. David, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thanks for taking the call.
You're very welcome.
I'm absolutely not a fan of Rishi Sunak or the Tories at all, but I'm actually really angry that he's come out with what he said.
Yeah.
I mean, to compare Scottish people to aggressive other nations is unbelievable. He's still there to represent us.
He is. Well, that's why I said. That's why I kept using the phrase "your prime minister," whether you like it or not.
Yeah, and that's
my prime minister.
Again, that's that. Yeah, I just think it's absolutely reprehensible that he thinks it's okay to throw that dead cat on the table to distract from the disaster that he's presided over. If he wasn't talking about doing harm to look at to help out.
I know.
That was his idea. That didn't go well.
But normally, you see, I think the last fellow had a point, Billy, when he just said maybe he's just rubbish at everything, David, because I can't. You can normally plot what you think they're up to, but I'm struggling on this one. I'm struggling.
It may well be the case. I also think he's trying to stigmatise Scottish nationalism. I think he's trying to sort of paint it with a brush that Scottish nationalism is something to be disliked, something to be distrusted, and the people that voice their opinions on pro-Scottish nationalism are not to be listened to. They're to be discarded and sort of kicked to the side as you know, you're not worthy of this conversation. And I think that's horrendous. It's so undemocratic. It's unbelievable.
Will it stick? Will it stick? I mean, what's your reading of the Scottish media this morning? I mean, is it the biggest story in town? Is it a bit of an?
The thing with politics in Scotland is possibly more polarised even than it is in Westminster.
I'll give you
so
that.
I think with some areas it might, but I think it will galvanise others. And if his intention was to drive a wedge between those two parts of the Scottish sort of political spectrum, I think it's worked. I think it will, to a degree, do that. But I don't think it will weaken the case for those that are pro-Scottish independence.
But they might tempt them back from Labour to the SNP, just as in a sort of outraged march. I don't know. I'm just trying to put. There's a vacuum where Rishi Sunak sits, and I'm trying to put into that vacuum.
There's a vacuum between his ears.
There is a vacuum between his ears. I think that's becoming increasingly clear. We've got a terrible problem in this country of thinking that being able to make a lot of money when you come from an incredibly privileged background means you must be possessed of a very you must be possessed of a very peculiar set of skills. It's known in the trade as the Rees-Mogg conundrum. But if he wasn't trying to achieve something, then he wouldn't have said it. I don't think. And there it is.
But the fact that we can't put a finger on what he was trying to achieve, I think, kind of leaves open for him to claim victory regardless of the outcome.
Do you think, and I won't hold you to this because my own predictions are awful and Natasha Clark's are even worse, but do you think that Stephen Flynn will bring it up at PMQs tomorrow?
I hope he does.
I hope he does as well.
I hope he does. Because I hope that every instance, and again, I say this as not as a Scottish nationalist, but as a person from Scotland,
yes.
I hope that every time the nation of Scotland, the people of Scotland are slighted in Westminster, that is brought up, because we are an equal part and just as loud a voice as anyone else. We have just the same right of representation as anyone else does in that parliament. Our MPs are there on the same merit as anyone else. Right. So for those to try and sort of downcry us because
to treat you as second-class citizens,
which
I've had a crash course on that, and now I see it so clearly when it's actually happening. It's borderline contempt sometimes when Sunak starts responding to the SNP questions at PMQs. And I suppose today there might have been a case for talking about Northern Ireland as well. Another corner, of course, of the United Kingdom, because the Rwanda deportation policy should not apply in Northern Ireland. A court ruled yesterday. A High Court ruled yesterday because it undermines human rights protections guaranteed, wait for it, under post-Brexit arrangements. So it's almost as if this lot couldn't organise a... Can I say that one? I can't really say it. Couldn't organise a drunken soiree in a brewery. 4 minutes after 12 is the time. Okay, I don't think this counts as a motoring... Well, it's not a motoring phone-in. I've tried in the last few months to break my... Because as I get older, I feel ever more equable and at one with the world, which is very, very gratifying and a big relief, actually. Normally it's the other way around. We all slowly turn into Homer Simpson's grandfather. But they didn't work well. They didn't work well. People have picked me up on this and said that somehow you knew that you were presenting an incredibly boring... There were two we did recently, one on buses. What was the other one? They were both essentially motoring phone-ins that I was desperately trying to pretend were not motoring phone-ins. It can't be trains. It was something road... But anyway, I don't want that to happen today because I do think this is really interesting. And I'd nearly said it in the last couple of weeks. I've nearly said it because you know what I'm like. I keep quite a close eye on right-wing media. And yeah, it might have been potholes. Was it potholes that led us into incredibly dull territory? So I would like to think... I was talking to Frank Skinner about this yesterday for an imminent episode of Full Disclosure. And there is something about being on the radio that is unlike all other media. I mean, he would say if you go on stage and he opens up a comedy avenue and it's not working, then he'll change direction and he'll go somewhere else. But if he's on the radio, when you can kid yourself that you're being hilarious in the absence of any audience, then you can... Bart Simpson's grandfather, not Homer Simpson, sorry. Then you can sort of stay there. So I felt that we turned our conversations about potholes and about buses into surreal radio flights of fancy. But I accept that you might just have heard a really dull phone-in about potholes and or buses. I hope not. I hope you had at least elements of surreal radio flights of fancy, but you may just have heard epic dullness. Today's not about dullness. Today's about bicycles. It's about cycling. And the thing I've nearly said to you over the last probably 3 or 4 weeks is that they're going to come for cyclists next. I'm surprised, and I'm not even joking, I'm surprised cyclists weren't on that list of Rishi Sunak's yesterday. I'm surprised he didn't say Russia, Iran, North Korea, anti-Semitism, anti-Muslim hatred, Scottish nationalists and cyclists. I'm surprised he didn't add cyclists to the list of perceived enemies of the people that the Tories are now desperately trying to seed in the minds of their supporters, both potential and actual. Because I think Ian Duncan Smith wrote something recently. Ian Duncan Smith is like a weather vane of awfulness, with the exception of foreign regimes, which he's actually quite good on. I've had it's not an unpleasant experience because when someone who's usually awful does something good, it's quite a pleasant experience. But the Venn diagram of me and Ian Duncan Smith has a tiny little intersection on things like sanctions against Russia and China, particularly Russia. I'm not that informed on China, but he's very good in that area. But other than that, he is like the most reliable weather vane of awfulness when it comes to ideas and policies. The way in which he jumps on bandwagons. Did you see what he said about ULEZ campaigners? He actually came out in favour of criminal damage. Nobody said a word. Could you imagine if Gary Lineker had done that in a way that upset the Daily Mail? It'd be on a front page for a fortnight. But a former leader of the Conservative Party can offer up can offer up pretty explicit support for people committing criminal damage and endangering the public by chopping down cameras. And Ian Duncan didn't even touch him. I don't think nobody even called him out on it except us, as far as I can remember. So he's written an article about how cyclists are a lawless menace. Dangerous cyclists are a lawless menace. And a terrible story in Regent's Park has seen this sort of a front open up again, where two people bombing around far too quickly, and one of them hit an elderly lady who subsequently died, which is bloody awful and absolutely heartbreaking. And we've all found ourselves in situations, either on a pavement or in a park, where a cyclist has gone past at such a speed that it's we've sort of stepped back in shock and amazement. And then James May, who I think is about as close to a national treasure. I say this as someone who doesn't even particularly like cars, but loves James May, has waded in to the conversation, suggesting that imposing further restrictions on cyclists is unnecessary because most people aren't fit enough to go fast. Then the motoring element to this intrigues me because motorists are normally adamant that there's far too many regulations and it's outrageous that they should be treated in the way that they're being treated. But ask them how they feel about cyclists, and a lot of them will queue up to tell you that they think cyclists should be exposed to all manner of regulations and rules and laws, and all the things that they think are a bad idea when they apply to them are an absolutely bloody brilliant idea when they would apply to other people. Final bit of this jigsaw, before I start trying to put the pieces together, is that almost every cyclist is also a motorist, right? I mean, everyone always forgets that. Everyone talks about cyclists as if they're a different species. So the thing I nearly said to you, I may have said it to you actually, you probably pay more attention to this bilge than I do, so if I did say it, then perhaps you can remind me when I said it. I said I wouldn't be surprised, because I told you that people on sickness benefit were going to be targeted and maligned and attacked. I told you that obese people would be moving back into the firing line sometime soon. I told you that the unemployed would be very much in the crosshairs as the election approached, because having essentially shot their own immigration fox by claiming that Brexit would fix it, they can only really bang on about the refugees coming here in small boats, and then of course not mentioning that the only reason they have to come in small boats is because they've shut down all the safe and legal routes themselves. So the immigration, what's the word I want? The behemoth, the electoral behemoth of immigration, which you now have the Tories and Richard Tice's vanity project fighting over. It doesn't have the teeth that it used to have for the Tories, because they've been in charge for 14 years and they sold us Brexit on the promise that it would reduce immigration for people who don't care about the health of the country but don't like hearing foreign voices on trains. So they need targets, the Tories. They need targets. But I felt it would be a little bit of a stretch to suggest to you that cyclists would be on the list. I just felt it, because it's what we've got now, what we've had for the last few years is government by 1980s radio phone-in. Now, I wasn't a radio phone-in host in the 1980s. I was still at school, but I listened. I used to listen to radio phone-ins as a fan, and sometimes I'd listen with a sort of grim fascination. And when I started work at LBC 20 years ago, you could get fairly predictable phone-ins off the ground by being vile about cyclists, obese people, anyone on strike, anybody unemployed, or anybody, what would be the fifth member of that? What would be the fifth finger on that hand? So here you go. Here's a radio phone-in programme from 1978. I'm going to be vile about obese people. I'm going to be vile about cyclists. I'm going to be vile about the unemployed. I'm going to be vile about people signed off sick. And I'm going to be vile about, there's got to be something else on that list that's a complete part. Traffic wardens. Would traffic wardens work for you? And it used to be confined to lazy radio phone-ins. And then suddenly, at some point over the last 4 or 5 years, it's become government policy. They've actually started going after precisely the lazy targets that lazy radio phone-in hosts have been going after for 30 or 40 years. And that's why I genuinely thought that cyclists should probably be careful. Now, I watch Jeremy Vine on social media because he is a crusader for cyclists, and the abuse that he attracts for simply recording and pointing out appalling behaviour on the roads is single mothers. Sorry, thank you, Mark. Single bloody mothers. How could I forget the single mothers? So it's the unemployed, it is obese people, it's cyclists, it's single mothers, and it's people signed off sick. Those are probably the top 5, are they? And have a look at the government policy now. The single mothers, be careful. A problem, I guess, in some ways, there's strength in numbers. There are so many single mothers around now that the effectiveness of demonizing and othering them has worn out because it has become completely normalized. But go back 20 or 30 years and you've got absolutely front of the queue, single mothers, feckless work shy layabouts. That'd be the unemployed. So you've got the single mothers popping out babies to get a council house. You've got the unemployed swinging the lead. They all spend their weekends in Ibiza. My window cleaner's sister knows someone who once went out with someone who went to school with someone who signs on and lives in Buckingham Palace. So you've got the single mothers, you've got the unemployed, the cyclists. Oh, they're a law unto themselves. Why don't they pay road tax? Oh, I hate them. Oh, I was driving down the road the other day and one came out of nowhere, go straight through the red lights, yada, yada, yada. People signed off sick. They're making it up. They're making it up as they, seriously, I saw him. I saw one of them. He was doing press-ups in the park. There's nothing wrong with him at all. And it's become government policy in the last few years. I forgot immigrants. I'm so sorry. How could I have forgotten him? Well, I was saying that the immigrants who 20 years ago would have been at the front of this queue, they can't go after the immigrants anymore because they promised that by encouraging us to become the first population in the history of humanity to vote to impose economic sanctions on ourselves, we'd be able to get rid of all the immigrants. But of course that didn't work, so the Tories can't go there. So they're back to the old targets. And that's why I think cyclists... Is the way I'm pronouncing cyclists problematic? Has anyone picked up on the way? I don't think it is. Cyclists. God, some people... Amanda, honestly, such a pedant, cyclists are now coming in for attack. Jeremy Vine is a wonderful example of it. James May feeling the need to... Ian Duncan Smith has weighed in. And I'm fascinated by this. Because I now am, I think I could loosely describe myself as a cyclist. I've always liked bicycles. I've always liked riding my bicycle. In fact, I might write a song about how much I like to ride my bicycle, as long as no one's beaten me to it. But recently I've started commuting by bicycle, which is a very different proposition. And it gives you some insights into how silly it is to generalise cyclists. It would be as silly as generalising motorists, pretending that the boy racer over there who wouldn't know a speed limit if it slapped him round the chops is exactly the same as the little old lady over there who only takes the car out on a Sunday. But I am now a cyclist, which means I can conduct this conversation, which I think we might have had before. I will conduct this conversation in a slightly different way from how I have previously. Because what I want to work out from a socio-political and philosophical perspective is why cyclists are so easily targeted. Because all of the others, Matt points out, is the unemployed obese cyclists who are the worst, James. Well, no, foreign, mate. It's the foreign unemployed obese cyclist that is the worst. See, none of those things should be sources of shame. None of those things should attract anger or hatred. Being unemployed should attract sympathy. Being obese should attract understanding and support. Being a cyclist should attract gratitude for helping keep the air cleaner for the rest of us and keep getting fewer cars on the road. Being an immigrant should be celebrated because you've chosen to come and live in this country while most of us are just here by accidents of birth. That speaks of a deeper level of commitment than most of us enjoy. But Apostolos picks up on something here. And he says, I've been a commuter cyclist for years, James, and I still can't stand cyclists. So what is it about this pastime, practice, these people? What is it that facilitates the painting of a target on their back in similar ways to all of the traditional target paintings? So all of the traditional otherings and demonizings, I've listed them. I keep forgetting some, but you know the list. Why cyclists? Why do cyclists attract such ire? That's a genuine question I've got for you. And what you can't do, especially if you're a taxi driver, is ring me up and tell me about the one who really annoyed you yesterday afternoon. All right? There's plenty of phone-in, well, I don't know if there are anymore, but there used to be plenty of phone-in shows where you can do that. I'm looking for something that is more universal, that is almost philosophical, because in other towns, and I'd love to speak to you if you can tell me more about this. So I've spent time, only as a visitor, as a tourist, Amsterdam and Copenhagen. Wonderful, wonderful Copenhagen. And cyclists are not in charge, but cyclists are wonderful. They're treated with respect, compassion, and concern in those towns. And I think London is changing. I can only speak for London. Well, no, I can speak for... I've noticed it a lot. Wherever the municipal bikes, like the Lime bikes or the Forest bikes, wherever the municipal bikes are proliferating, cycling is becoming a lot more pleasant and a lot more considered and possibly considerate. Wherever there are bike lanes, the world is changing under our noses, before our very eyes. And yet, in Copenhagen and Amsterdam, there's no, as far as I know, there's no groundswell of hatred and resentment from the... It was there when it started, if you're in either of those towns, or towns where cycling is absolutely part of the fabric. What was it like at the beginning? 0345 6060 973. And how quickly did it become what it is now, where cyclists are valued, protected, and cherished? Because at the moment they're not. And what I want you to tell me is why. Why are cyclists so easily... So just for the record, I'm a brilliant cyclist. I even stop at zebra crossings when I could easily make it through without the person having to even slow down or break their stride. I'm super, super, super careful. But there are occasions where I find myself thinking, well, why am I sitting here waiting at a light when... There's literally nobody. There's nothing on the road. But I often think, if I was in a car, would I drive down there? But I don't have a massive problem with cyclists who go over an empty crossing when there's absolutely nobody there. I did it once, actually, the other day, coming up the Mall. There wasn't a vehicle on the road, but the traffic light was red. There wasn't a vehicle anywhere. Like the junctions behind me, ahead of me, it was completely empty. But why? Why are they so easily hated? What is it about this relationship that allows such vitriol to come into a space that is normally reserved for other utterly blameless members of society, such as foreigners and single mothers? 03, good God, it's 21 minutes after 12. Is he ever going to shut up? 24 minutes after 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where it's a strange conversation, but I think it's a pertinent one. Ian Duncan Smith has weighed in. National Treasure James May has weighed in. A tragic death in Regent's Park involving a cyclist bombing around at full speed and a poor lady getting in his way or being hit by him. I'm not here to dispute what language should and should not be used, but the easy demonisation of cyclists just intrigues me. I want to try and work out where it comes from, what causes it. Martin's in Reading. Martin, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Thanks for taking this. I'm quite interested to hear you throwing in this idea of adding cyclists to that list.
Do you think it's a fair analysis? I mean, did it make sense? God knows I went on for long enough, Martin. I hope it made sense.
No, it isn't. It does. I mean, I'm speaking as I'm pretty much a lifelong cyclist. I work in the cycle industry these days, but I'm also, as you pointed out, I'm also a driver. I'm also a pedestrian. I'm just a person. But as speaking as a cyclist, it is one of the oldest cultural wars.
Yes, it is, isn't it?
For such a long time, really.
Yes.
Why?
Why?
Absolutely.
Why?
Well, I think it comes down to a couple of things. You asked the question, what makes cyclists such an easy target? I think it comes down to probably a couple of things. One is visibility, and the other is the sense of otherness and how easy it is to other someone. If you think about it, the roads are, and particularly I think I'm not in London, I'm in Reading, but I know everywhere the roads are pretty much of a bit of a battleground sometimes.
Can be, yes.
And they can, and when you experience bad behaviour from other road users, if you're a driver, which most people are, you can't just sort of other drivers because you're one of them. You're a driver, so say, the behaviour of drivers these days, because you're pretty much including yourself, and we're all sort of guilty to an extent.
Yes, but this pushes us away from understanding the othering, not towards it.
Well, not really, I don't think, because what we do as drivers is we other white van man and school run mums and Audi drivers.
It's all broken down.
Yes. So you break it down into, it's not me, it's somebody else. And if you're a driver but not a cyclist, cyclists, it's easy just to see an example of bad behaviour from cyclists and literally lump every single cyclist under that banner, under that heading.
But even then, the levels of vitriol and unpleasantness that one sees directed at people like Jeremy Vine are hard to credit, aren't they? Or are they not?
Well,
because Jeremy Vine's not one. Jeremy Vine is a careful cyclist.
I know, I think to any reasonable human being, then yes, it is. But as I say, this is one of the oldest culture wars out there.
I think you're right. I wish I'd thought of that line. It is one of the first fronts.
It really is, and it's been driven by the media, by Jeremy Clarksons of the world, your columnists and your wannabe Jeremy Clarkson columnists.
Do they all do that? They all attack cyclists. It's such an odd.
Like you said yourself, back in the 80s phone-in days, it's such an easy target.
Oh, I hate those cyclists. I think
because it's been going on so long, it just makes it.
Okay. That's the first item of evidence. I mean, I'm going to need a lot more than that. But because where else do we take one bad example and use it to malign an entire population? Racists do it. Obviously, you find one person from a specific background committing a crime, and you claim that everybody from that background is a criminal, and you can end up in the White House. But most, as Martin describes as sensible people, don't do that. And yet I know for a fact from previous conversations that sensible people will behave like the worst of us on this issue, even when they're enlightened and decent on all the other areas of demonisation and othering. Thank you, Martin. Neil's in Peterborough. Neil, what would you like to say? What do you think is going on there?
Yeah, I believe it's when you're on a push bike and stuff like that, you can get on with your journey, especially when you're in London and places like that. You can see them cutting through traffic and sort of jumping the queue, if you like, and slowing down.
Do you think that's what it is?
I think so. I think because I'm a cyclist myself as well. So when I'm on my bike, you don't realise that you're sort of conscious about traffic around you, but you're not sort of thinking about it. But when you're in a car and you say you're in a queue and you see a push bike come down the side of you and take about 15 spaces up in front of you, sometimes you think...
so it's jealousy?
But I think so as well.
Even though there's nothing to stop, you could be on your bike instead if you wanted.
It's a similar thing to like in the country roads when there's a tractor. The tractor's slowing you down on your journey. You moan about the tractors.
Yes.
So when in push bikes, when you're in the road and the push bike going on, it's slowing you down.
They don't really do. That doesn't happen very often, does it? When you're slowed down, you got to slow down before you overtake or something like that. I'm a great believer. I don't drive much, and I don't know now at this age that I ever will. But I'm always struck by the person who overtakes you in an obnoxious fashion, ending up next to you at the next set of traffic lights. It's always a weird rush that everybody else is in. I cycle in a very leisurely fashion, Neil, and that can wind people up sometimes.
It can, exactly, yeah.
But not the car drivers, because I'm always on bike lanes now. So I get angry cyclists behind me ringing their bell and tooting and trying to slide past me at the junctions and stuff like that, because I like to ride a bit like I ride a bit like Miss Marple, or like the teacher, like the woman in The Wizard of Oz who turns into the witch after Dorothy falls asleep. I ride a nice leisurely.
That's leisurely.
But that's the future.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, I mean, I live not far from Cambridge, and Cambridge it seems to be accepted.
But that's the students. They've been doing it forever. I don't know whether they've changed. They probably have changed the road. So there are towns where it happens. I wonder how long the process takes. James is just back from Paris. He writes, look what's happened in Paris. Cyclists have taken over and are now welcomed, having previously been hated. I didn't know that. Last time I was there, they were having huge problems with the scooters, not with the bicycles, but with the scooters. But one of my girls was there recently and she got her Lime bike. She used a Lime bike quite a lot and said it was really pleasant. And I'm really nervous, obviously. Cycling in at all makes you nervous. But now, with the cycle lanes, I mean, what's not to like? Answer, apparently loads. It's 12:30. Amelia Cox has your headlines. 12:34 is the time. It's a bit weird, isn't it, when you think about it, because so far nobody's actually disputing my analysis. So you list all of the things that the right wing traditionally other and demonise in the hope of distracting the rest of us from things like, the unfair distribution of wealth, or the fact that the right wing are responsible for most of the things that go wrong in a country. So in order to distract us all from their own malfeasance, corruption and pocket lining, they like to target minorities, or they like to other communities. And some of them are really obvious. Single mothers, historically, unemployed people. Sadly, recently, for the current iteration of the Tory party, disabled people and people who signed off work sick. Traditionally, of course, immigrants would be very much on this list. Trade unions, anyone going on strike. Even if they're not on strike, teachers come in. So they're brilliant at it, absolutely brilliant at it. It's why the country allows the madness to continue. The European Union. So how do cyclists end up on that list of things that are very easily demonised and othered? I still don't know. Ruth's in Chiswick. Ruth, what can you tell us?
I think the issue is, you just said it yourself, I'm afraid, James, about this cyclist bombing around. I'm 71. You and I have spoken before. I cycle absolutely everywhere. And this change in Chiswick with Cycleway 9 is phenomenal. The uptake in cycling, especially amongst young women. You mentioned your daughter in Paris using a Lime bike.
We can't go postcode specific on this, Ruth. Even though it's a part of London I know well. But I've got people listening in Ulaanbaatar and Dundee. So
let's talk about those.
So where does the demonisation come from? Why are cyclists so easily demonised?
Okay, the use of the word cyclist. I mean, I don't ever call myself a cyclist. I just cycle. I happen to drive. I happen to walk. I use buses.
Yes, but when you're on your bicycle, you are a cyclist. When you're in your car, you are a motorist.
Yes, that's true when I'm doing those activities.
Yes.
But like now, standing here talking to you, I'm not a cyclist. I'm talking to you because I use a bike to get around, and I use a bike for many things. One of the reasons that we don't see many women cycling, or we don't see many older people, disabled people cycling, is because we simply don't have the space for them to do so.
It's not safe.
So therefore, exactly, and it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You get the kind of cyclist that you build, that you build infrastructure for.
So the ones who are almost riding aggressively in order to protect themselves can earn a bad name for everybody else.
Yeah. Also, planning comes into it, because our planning systems, in terms of housing, there's often the accusation that only the wealthy, the male, the 40-year-old, blah, 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 can cycle. But that's also because they often live somewhere they can keep their bikes. If you live in a housing estate and there's nowhere to store your bike, which is probably why e-scooters are quite useful, because then you can take it indoors and you've got it.
And these
we have a real problem
bicycles,
with storage.
yes. Which is why I'm seeing more and more of those sort of silos springing up on streets, where I guess you have a shared padlock or a shared combination, and you can store your bikes in there. The storage is quite a big deal. It's also why these electric bikes are so popular, because you don't, you can cycle to work, but you don't actually have to cycle home again. You can leave the bike.
Well, no, quite. Yes, and what you see in Holland as well is cycling is combined cycling. So you cycle to the station, you leave it there.
On the train. I think you spend a lot of time in
Holland. Another one at the other end.
You know the Netherlands well,
I've literally just come back.
Lucky thing.
There.
So do we know how long it took the culture to change there? Because I think it was in 1971, would you believe, that there was some sort of uprising on the streets in response to the number of cyclists who were getting hurt. So between then and now, which is more or less the course of my life, Amsterdam in particular has been transformed. Do we know how?
But we can't, well, yes, I know, but we can't keep referring to that. One thing is, yes, it was in the 70s, but I'm, as I said, 70.
Yes.
I cycled as a child in the 50s and 60s.
Yes.
You're younger than me, but we all did.
Mm.
It then came about, there was more access to cars, cheap fuel, etc., etc. Yes, in Holland, but I lived in Amsterdam in 1976, and we already cycled everywhere there were cycle lanes. There was objections in Amsterdam, yes. But what they have done is they've mandated that every time a road scheme is built, a cycle scheme has to be built as well. Look at the disaster of HS2. It was supposed to have a cycle lane all the way along it. You go to Europe, almost every rail line has cycle lanes along them. We don't have that. They have to be mandated by government funding, by municipality funding. Here we struggle to fill our potholes. So when you're cycling, especially in the countryside, you've got awful verges. We then take the lane, then the drivers shout at us because they feel that we're blocking their space, which we're not. We're just staying safe. So it's all about continuing that culture. And the fact is, it didn't take 50 years. They're refining it constantly.
Yes.
We can't keep saying, "Oh, but look at them; they've had 50 years to get it."
No, I didn't flipping out. I didn't say that.
No,
I just said I'd stumbled across an article. I talked about Paris a couple of minutes ago. Paris have been on this journey and remain on this journey, but that's changed in a relatively short period of time.
But that's also because Hidalgo she's just decided to do it. Here, yes. Sadiq has to go through every single borough, like the Royal Borough of Kensington, Chelsea, to just out of hand reject.
They're outrageous. I get on at Brentford, and it hasn't opened yet, that cycle lane, but when it does, I'll be able to go all the way from Brentford, through Chiswick, where you are, up to Hammersmith, past Olympia, and then at Kensington High Street, there's no cycle lane.
Life in your hands.
And life in my hands. And that terrible crossroads as well, near the hotel where Tower Records used to be. And then I like to go up through Kensington Park Gardens. I come off the road completely, but that's just because I'm a very leisurely cyclist, you see, Ruth. Very leisurely approach I take to it. But Kensington and Chelsea, they're barbaric on this.
Well, they've just put a consultation out how to green Notting Hill Gate area.
Okay.
I mean, you have to laugh, really.
Yes.
But just then back, because we need to be more countrywide, as you say. In terms of slowing people who cycle down, there are also other much better ways of doing it than the kind of barriers that we put in here. And barriers affect disabled people, and disabled people do cycle. I'm sure you've spoken to Wilson Wellbeing, very wonderful Isabel, is that, if you can't drive and you can't walk, you can often get around on a disability bike.
Yes.
And that we need to make much safer and much more accessible. And then the take-up will be phenomenal.
And then it reaches a sort of critical mass, and the balance itself, the balance of power, actually, not just the balance of rhetoric, starts to shift. And speaking of disabilities, this is from Simon. I've never rung you before, James, but this is the closest I've ever come. Not because the conversation is making me angry in any way, but because I feel qualified to give you an angle that hasn't come up. I don't think, today. I am deaf-blind, and there is a distinct lack of understanding from both cyclists and motorists towards physical disabilities on highways. I think you're right, and I don't know what the redress looks like, Simon, but listening to people like you would clearly be a start. 12:41 is the time. It's a weird one, this, actually, because I thought some people might get cross or exercised by me lumping all these things together, and by the cycling being another example of sort of lazy othering. Well, the first caller essentially described it as one of the very first fronts in the culture war. I think the best way to describe culture wars is when people with power give you permission to attack other people. That's the best way of understanding a culture war. It usually comes from the right, and it will say, here are some people you have my permission to attack, and they'll normally be more vulnerable than you, or they'll be measurably, visibly, perhaps observably different from you. And because most of us are fundamentally okay people who don't go out of our way to cause offence on a regular basis, the message from on high, whether it's the Prime Minister talking about the Scottish nationalists, or whether it's 30p Lee talking about immigrants, or whether it's people with a bit of authority, newspaper columnists writing about cyclists, you're given permission to be irrationally rude about another section of society. And I think cyclists fit into that category pretty well. Oscar's in Chertsey. Oscar, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. I'm going to be a bit cliche, and I'm going to say long-time listener, first-time caller.
I've been breaking records today. I can't remember the last time we had so many first-time callers. Must be doing something right, Oscar. Carry on.
So I'm a kind of long-time cyclist. I'm 28, but I actually lived in the Netherlands for a year.
Right.
Ironically enough, moved there just after the referendum. Did my own kind of little leaving escapade.
Well done.
And then came back a year later to do the rest of my studies, and then started cycling in the UK. And I noticed there's a big difference in terms of the infrastructure is obviously
it's getting a lot better.
Different.
It's getting a lot better. Here.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I used to live in South London. I know I'm not going to mention any postcodes like any previous callers. So I used to do a sort of 40-minute commute every morning from kind of like Lewisham area to sort of Croydon, and that obviously doesn't have any cycling infrastructure.
Well, you say obviously. Bless you.
I did it every
what
day,
are my listeners in
James.
Ulaanbaatar? This is why I said don't mention any specific. Obviously, there's no cycling infrastructure between Lewisham and Chelsea.
I've backpedaled ever so slightly. Okay, fine. For anyone else,
so let me steer you towards why. We, they, you are so easily targeted in fashions that are traditionally reserved for more obviously otherable sections. Because we all rode bicycles as kids, and yet something happens after puberty that if you end up with a newspaper column or a radio show, you're going to be talking about cyclists with as much contempt as you normally reserve for unemployed people and single mothers. How does that bit work? That last bit right there.
I mean, I suppose there is like a kind of otherism in a sense of the fact that you kind of bundle certain characteristics into one, and there's I'm sure that there's a picture that those kind of people sort of paint when they think about a cyclist. I'm assuming they probably think that they're vegan and they also cycle on a fixed gear bike, which I actually do.
Are you a vegan?
Not really. I'm not a vegan.
Well, there you go. One out of two. But increasingly,
exactly. I live in Surrey now, so
I notice now, is because I'm doing it almost every day, that these stereotypes no longer actually apply. You've got the ones in the full kit. And I understand now why they do that, because of the weather and because of sweating and because they want to be a bit fresher when they get to work or whatever the reasons may be. But the mix now, you've got a bloke in flip-flops, you've got a bloke over there in a full three-piece suit, you've got me tooling along in my shacket, you've got and you've got women riding, some in full kit, some wearing a nice summer dress. The London is changing in front of us.
Yeah, 100%. But what I would say though, and I did make this point to your producer earlier, which was that. So one thing that I noticed, and I think it could actually sort of lead into a kind of another element as to why people might have their back up about cyclists a little bit, is that when I moved over back from the Netherlands back to the UK and then started cycling London again for a while, I did notice a bit of a difference in terms of the attitude that cyclists have towards the kind of laws of the road.
Yeah.
I mean, I cycle all the time. I've actually been hit by a car before. So as a result, I treat the rules like with the greatest of respect.
Yes.
But I don't know if you ever kind of cycled around sort of the centre of town.
Yes, I have. Lots of people are making this point. So you mean that they're not rogue cyclists, but they are aggressive. They're sort of aggressive cyclists who don't really. I mean, they're the ones that possibly frighten car drivers, because if you're in charge of a ton of metal and someone flies in front of you in a way that is endangering them, your adrenaline is going to kick in at least as much as theirs is, because you're going to be absolutely terrified of hurting them. And I don't know how widespread this is, but almost everyone raises this point at some point in this conversation, that a small minority who jump the lights or who ride aggressively or who don't stop at zebra crossings are ruining it for everybody else. I buy it up to a point, but the way that these people talk about cycling in general, like, it's a bit like I don't mean you, isn't it? We're back to I don't mean you territory, where someone, which again applies to single mothers and immigrants and unemployed. Oh no, I don't mean you. I mean the bad ones. But you're talking as if you mean all of us. Yeah, but I don't mean you. Yeah, but you do, don't you? Really? Well, yeah, I suppose. So that bit there. There are some rotters on two wheels, but there's no way that people who are rude about cyclists mean exclusively and only the rotters. It is 12:51 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I've got a horrible feeling that I've missed a few unhinged headlines over the last couple of weeks. I thought I was paying attention, but it would seem that I've missed a few. But I don't want to do that first. We'll get back to bicycles in a moment. We'll get back on our bikes. And thank you to whoever it was that wrote in and said, actually, James, I think Queen did a song called I Like to Ride My Bicycle. I was obviously joking when I said I'd like to ride my bicycle, and I might write a song about that one day if nobody has beaten me to it. But thank you to the very literal-minded listener who got in touch via WhatsApp to tell me that sadly Queen have indeed kind of beaten me to that with some lyrical swing. We haven't done Woke Watch for ages, and it's not an obvious Woke Watch, but what I want to do is use the Woke Watch banner, because I just want to make sure it still works, to illustrate something that I've pointed out to you a few times in the past, and it is the way in which that the double standards of the British media are rarely more acute than in the case of Prince Harry and his brother. Woke Watch. So 2 headlines for you, and I want you to think about this. The first we've already alluded to, because I'm sure you will join me in congratulating Prince William in seeing off all the competition to become Colonel-in-Chief of the Army Air Corps, an appointment made by his father, King Charles. So that William's done that. He's on a roll at the moment. He's just got made Prince of Wales, and again I was gutted. I thought I might be in with a chance this time, and now he's been made Colonel-in-Chief of Prince Harry's old regiment after a very, very rigorous process of endurance tests, assault courses, interviews, and he was the one that got over the line. And that headline, the Sun choose to go with, Wills gets his hands on Harry's chopper. And it's an unalloyed celebration of Prince William, who didn't serve in this regiment, becoming Colonel-in-Chief of a regiment in which Prince Harry served. So that's headline number 1. Headline number 2, and it took me a moment to realise why I was so distracted by this story and the way the Daily Mail have written it up. And it's not because Rory Stewart gets the non-fiction Book of the Year prize. It's circumstances in which not winning is a bigger story than winning. So this is the first paragraph of a story in the Daily Mail, which appears under the headline, Puzzle Book Beats Spare to Top Award. This is mad. Remember, we're supposed to be cheering Prince William being made Colonel-in-Chief of a regiment he was never in by his own dad. That's great. Well done. Whoa, get in. Winner. #champ. This is the first paragraph of a book about the British Book Awards. Prince Harry's memoir, Spare, was beaten at last night's British Book Awards in every category it was nominated. How mean and bent can coverage of an award ceremony be? That what is the top line? Prince Harry got beaten. He's written a book, with some help, I'm sure, that has become one of the best-selling non-fiction books of all time. And they can't even bring themselves to mention that. It's done over 700,000 copies. And it's not come out in paperback yet either. So that's an extraordinary figure. It really is. But the Daily Mail writes it up as him being beat. It doesn't say it's very rare for a non-fiction book to be nominated in more than one category. It doesn't pick up on the achievement. It mentions the sales, but only because I guess it has to. And yet they choose to sell the story as Prince Harry's memoir was beaten at last night's British Book Awards in every category it was nominated. So on one hand, on one side of the British media, Prince William gets given an honorary job by his dad and it's front page news of the Sun newspaper. And in others, Prince Harry, who's never written a book before, writes one of the best-selling books ever in hardback and doesn't win some awards. And that's the headline. That's the story. Prince Harry doesn't win awards. I know it's not technically Woke Watch, but given that Harry is widely regarded as one of the patron saints of woke, I am today prepared to file it under
Woke Watch.
12:55 is the time. Back to the bicycles. Ross is in Millwall. Ross, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello,
I want to mainly talk about cycling, and that sort of wider cultural context is there. But and I particularly want to talk about Jeremy Vine.
Okay.
Now, don't panic. I'm not going to use any unwarranted nicknames or anything like that.
No, well, not even nicknames. There's some outrageous stuff going on. But okay, but we've not got loads of time, so go on.
Yeah,
fill your
I've
boots.
actually had a couple of back and forths with him on X, and I just, he seems like an okay guy on TV and radio, but I think what he does on social media for cycling is poison.
Do you?
For cyclists.
Tell me
I think
why.
it damages. Well, I think it's, and it's part of, how he does kind of other, that he's emblematic of a kind of cyclist that does kind of other themselves with all the gear and, the cameras. Yeah. So that's a small point to one point.
Okay, well, give me the big points then.
The main point is, if you watch just a few of his videos, he is shamelessly chasing problems. And so given a bike lane, you're given some space on the road, and he uses that to ride as fast as he can.
Yeah.
I'm not saying he's breaking the limit or anything, but probably about 20 miles an hour. And so 50 metres ahead, there's a truck trying to turn left. He will not slow down. He'll
Well, he's not here to defend himself, and I was using him more as an emblem of targeting than as a sort of neat depiction of what he does. So
you referred to him a few times.
No, I did, but only as an example of how much vitriol they attract, and you're perfectly entitled to ring in and say he deserves all the vitriol, but that's very much in the eye of the beholder.
I just think it's is emblematic of a very big problem. I'm very pro-cycling.
But how can it be that big a problem if we can only name one person that does it?
Well, no, there's plenty who do it online. He's the most prominent. There's some well-known ones. But anyway, just even in real life...
But they're pointing out what they would call bad driving.
Yeah, indeed. And they find plenty of cases. There's always plenty of cases of bad driving.
Isn't that a good thing?
No, not in the way that they do it, because there's zero empathy for any trucks that need to deliver or pick up rubbish. It's like he's never had a delivery or thrown anything out in his life.
Right.
I come from Melbourne. I much prefer driving, cycling, and walking in London because it's a bit slower speed. It's more cooperative, and I think the culture that Jeremy Vine embodies goes against that. It's saying,
well, again, I don't know enough about his modus operandi to know how fair or unfair you're being, but certainly some of the abuse that he's attracted in recent months has been. I believe it's in the hands of my learned friends, but I hear you. Maybe sometimes the cyclists. There's another one, isn't there, who's always catching people using their phone behind the wheel of the car. But I don't personally have a problem with that. As a general rule, if you don't want to get into trouble for doing something that you're not supposed to be doing, then don't do the thing that you're not supposed to be doing. But anyway, you've put forward a counter position to what you'd heard previously, which is always healthy. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, the official LBC app, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. Download it now for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now it's time for Sheila Fogarty. 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 Now